Chapter 14, Black and White. Merston Aerodrome used to lie just south of the main Bognor Regis to Chichester Road, between the English Channel and the West Sussex Downs. There is no trace of it today. A ghostly airman returning would see only cereal fields, flanked by row after row of polytunnels filled with ripening soft fruit. Nothing at all that hints at the stupendous enterprise these few acres were once part of. In the early summer of 1944, Merston was a temporary airfield, with 2 steel mesh runways laid over the dirt, and tents instead of huts for the air and ground staff. It was home to 145 Wing of the RAF, made up of 2 fighter squadrons manned by the Free French, another mainly British Spitfire squadron, plus a transport unit flying Douglas DC-3 Dakotas. On the evening of the 5th of June, officers were called to a briefing from the CO. Group Captain Adolf Sailor Mallon was a celebrated Battle of Britain pilot, a South African of Afrikaner stock. He looked pugnacious with his close-cut blonde hair and square jaw, and was famous for his aggression in the air. On the ground, he was surprisingly mild and introspective. The audience had a good idea of what he was about to say. He came into the tent and informed us quite quietly that the show was on, wrote one of those present, an RAF regiment officer called John Rolfe, to a female friend a year later. I can capture the atmosphere easily now. The smell of the tent in the hot sun, and one of the tent flaps banging in the wind. As he spoke, we heard the first wave of gliders going over, and suddenly it dawned on me that it was our supreme effort. The sound and sight of aeroplanes overhead, of all shapes and sizes, and in vast, amazing numbers, would be indelibly imprinted on the memories of everyone in southern England that summer. 38 years afterwards, John Keegan recalled how as a boy he watched the Somerset countryside fill up with the troops and war machines, and then one night suddenly empty. One evening, the sky over our house began to fill with the sound of aircraft, which swelled until it overflowed the darkness from edge to edge. Its first tremors had taken my parents into the garden, and as the roar grew, I followed and stood between them to gaze, awestruck, at the constellation of red, green, and yellow lights which rode across the heavens and streamed southwards towards the sea. It seemed as if every aircraft in the world was in flight, as wave followed wave without intermission. In this first great southward-heading flock were 1,000 heavy bombers with night fighter escorts, tasked with pounding the reinforced concrete strongpoints and gun emplacements of the Atlantic Wall, transports laden with paratroopers and tugs towing gliders crammed with infantrymen. Further north, a decoy operation was underway. A 617 squadron, the Dambusters, scattered bundles of tin-foil window which lit up German radar screens, creating the impression of an invasion fleet approaching the Pas-de-Calais at 7 knots, and for a few crucial hours sowing confusion about where the real blow was falling. Just before dawn, it was the turn of the fighters and fighter-bombers. At Merston, the pilots were told they would be providing dawn-to-dusk cover of the invasion. They were to operate over Omaha Beach on the Calvados coast, where the Americans met the fiercest resistance of the day. For the airmen looking down, the carpet of ships butting across the channel was an awesome sight that matched the spectacle the air fleet presented in the skies. Flight Lieutenant Stanley de Vere, a 25-year-old New Zealander fighter pilot who was temporarily on ground control duties, wangled himself onto a patrol in the middle of the afternoon. It was amazing, he wrote in his diary. From Portsmouth Harbour and Southampton to the beachhead was a lane of every type of craft, from battleships to small infantry landing craft. Warships from battleships to small corvettes were hurrying around each convoy and fussing like a hen over her chicks. Then just off the beachhead, still greater numbers of ships were lying, the battleships shelling enemy positions on the shore. Saw one destroyer, which had been sunk, its funnels and some of the superstructure were showing above the water. Ken Paddy French, a Spitfire pilot with 66 Squadron, was thrilled by the panoramic view of the warships belching shells and the landing craft running up the beaches, but felt strangely detached from it all. The tongues of flame shooting from gun barrels, the flash of exploding shells, were oddly soundless, and it was hard to grasp that the scene was accompanied by terrible noise and the fact that thousands of men were dying on the beaches below. While marvelling at the Armada, French's main thought had been relief that, should he be shot down, there were plenty of boats to pick him up. As it turned out, it was 2 days before he saw enemy aircraft. Flying back to base with another squadron member after both developed engine trouble, they spotted a pair of Me-109s. They were pretty sure they had seen us, as they emitted a little puff of smoke indicating that they were accelerating. But they were speeding away, not towards them. The Luftwaffe, for the moment at least, was in no mood or condition for a fight. The Allies would enjoy the priceless asset of the freedom of the skies for most of the campaign. Air superiority was a sine qua non of the Overlord plan. Lavish air power was essential to cover the landing beaches as the armies struggled ashore to shield them from the inevitable counterattacks as they carved out a breachhead, to prepare the ground for the push forward, and to create the conditions for the breakout that led to victory. Clearly, this called for the closest possible cooperation between land and air, as Bernard Montgomery, commanding the Allied ground forces in Normandy, spelled out in a letter to Miles Dempsey, commander of the British Second Army, a month before landing. "I feel very strongly that we can achieve no real success unless each army and its accompanying air force can wield itself into one entity," he declared. He looked forward to the continuation of the happy situation that had developed in the Middle East and Italy, where the spirit of unity went right down to the individual soldier and airman. The Normandy enterprise would reassemble some of the key players in those campaigns. Arthur Tedder, who had worked side by side with Monty since 1942, was Deputy Supreme Allied Commander and Coordinator of Air Activities. The great desert air warrior Arthur Conyngham was Chief of the RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force, a huge assembly of light bombers, and the new generation of fighter bombers that would roam the battlefield that summer. Familiarity did not breed affection or respect. As head of the Desert Air Force, Conyngham had fallen out badly with Montgomery over his failure to fall on Rommel's retreating army after Alamein. Tedder derided his claims to great generalship and deplored his boastfulness and publicity-seeking. In early 1943, he shared his opinion with U.S. General George Patton. Monty, he wrote, was a little fellow of average ability who has had such a build-up that he thinks of himself as Napoleon. He is not. Nothing that happened in Normandy would cause him or Conyngham to revise their opinions. The air operations that preceded Overlord were intelligently conceived and executed on a massive scale. Never before had air power been used with such care and in such quantity. The sharp efficiency demonstrated by the Allied air forces before and during the campaign stood out against the duller performance of the forces on the ground. The landings themselves were a brilliant success, but thereafter progress disappointed. For all his bold talk, Montgomery showed his habitual caution. His commanders bungled opportunities, and misunderstandings and balls-ups abounded. Monty's tricky personality guaranteed trouble with his chief, Eisenhower, and the leading American generals Bradley and Patton. His insistence that everything was going according to his master plan sounded increasingly hollow as weeks passed, and the crucial Caen sector, which he had led everyone to believe could be taken on D-Day, remained firmly in German hands. The Allied armies were up against the most formidable soldiers in the world, courageous and fanatically determined, who made maximum use of the difficult terrain and their still considerable resources, directed by field commanders of the caliber of Erwin Rommel. On the other hand, the invaders had the priceless asset of a huge air force, which did everything that was asked of it swiftly and effectively. For months before the first soldiers hit the beaches, the Allied squadrons had been working to a plan that would undermine the Luftwaffe's powers and shape the battlefield to the Allies' liking. Before the air campaign started, the USAAF and Bomber Command launched a week-long assault on German aircraft factories, designed to structurally undermine the Luftwaffe by attacking its industrial base, as well as luring it into an attritional battle to whittle away aircraft and aircrew. The continual losses the German Air Force suffered on the three fronts it was fighting on in the spring of 1944 meant that, when the time came, it was unable to contribute much to the defence of Normandy, let alone seriously challenge the Allies in the air. The preparations and the post-invasion air campaign were the responsibility of the Allied Expeditionary Air Force, AEAF, under Trafford Leigh-Mallory, who was moved from Fighter Command to become Commander-in-Chief in November 1943. It grouped together the new formations created for the invasion, the RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force, 2nd TAF, and the United States 9th Air Force, 9th USAF, as well as units of Fighter Command. Leigh-Mallory did not, however, control either Bomber Command or the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, which for the time being remained at the disposal of the combined Chiefs of Staff. He was far from being the ideal man for the job. Many of his British and American peers regarded Leigh-Mallory as uncongenial and incompetent, and friction over control was guaranteed. AEAF was nonetheless a hive of original thinking. In January 1944, a bombing committee was set up whose members included Professor Solly Zuckerman, a South African-born zoologist who had worked with Tedder in Italy studying the effects of bombardment. He and other experts involved the transportation plan, aimed at paralyzing German rail communications, by first attacking marshalling yards and maintenance and repair facilities in the wider network, before moving on to tactical targets like bridges, locomotives, and rolling stock inside the invasion zone. The certainty of civilian casualties alarmed politicians, senior airmen, and Eisenhower himself. Predictably, the plan was opposed by Arthur Harris and his U.S. counterpart Karl Spaatz on the grounds that it would divert their bombers from their proper function of destroying Germany's industry and undermining civilian morale. The success of experimental operations in March against rail centres in France and Belgium, significant civilian deaths notwithstanding, persuaded military and political leaders to back it. By D-Day, 80 railway targets had been attacked, and in the words of the official history, the movement of German troops and material by rail had thus become a matter of very great difficulty and hazard. Such trains as still ran moved very slowly, were forced to make long detours and travelled only at night. The enemy had no freedom of movement in a large part of France and Belgium, and would therefore find it difficult, if not impossible, to marshal troops quickly for a decisive counterattack. In the weeks before the landing, airfields, coastal batteries, and radar sites were blasted up and down the coast of northern France, and in the last days, bridges over the Seine. At least as many raids were mounted outside the landing zone as in it. Thus was maintained the deception that the real invasion was aimed at the Pas-de-Calais, a bluff that succeeded beyond the wildest hopes of the Allies, planting a misconception in the Germans' minds that would endure for many weeks after D-Day. In the spring and early summer of 1944, temporary airfields like Merston sprang up like mushrooms in bucolic corners of southern England. The familiar fighters of the RAF had undergone an evolution. The Spitfires of 66th Squadron could now carry 500-pound bombs to add another dimension to their capabilities. Dive bombing had come late to the Air Force, and it took some time to work out the best method of delivery. Paddy French recalled how initially they would fly over the target at 10,000 feet, and when we saw it appear behind our wing, we would turn over on our backs, going into a steep dive aiming at the target. At 2,000 feet, the pilot was supposed to pull out of the dive and count 3 seconds before releasing his bomb, yanking the stick back as the ground approached at 300 miles an hour, then swooping upwards again to avoid anti-aircraft fire. At this point, French always blacked out because of the G-force, but the plane would keep climbing and then you would come round again. He found the technique rather haphazard, and accuracy could not be guaranteed. The pilots soon came up with a better method, which was both safer and much more effective. We would come right down low and fly the plane directly at the target, and at the last second release the bomb so that it would go straight into the target, and at the same time you would lift the plane over the top. You couldn't really miss. More formal training was on offer to the men leading the fighter-bomber units. 6 months before D-Day, Geoffrey Page, commanding 132 Squadron, was sent on a course at the fighter training school at Millfield in Northumberland, which had just opened to teach leaders the special skills needed for close support operations flown from frontline airfields. There was snow on the ground when he arrived, which contrasted with the cosy warmth of the officers' mess. There he met a milling throng of cheerful young men who, despite their youth, sported the ranks of squadron leaders and wing commanders, combined with decorations for gallantry. Together they represented the spearhead of leadership in the air for the coming invasion. After breakfast on the first day, they listened to a welcoming speech from a young air commodore who quickly got down to essentials, telling them, "For the next 3 weeks you will fire your guns and practice dive bombing until it is second nature. On the beaches near here are convoys of lorries of different shapes and sizes. There are also tanks. These you will attack with cannons and rockets, followed by an inspection on foot of the damage caused. You will learn through trial and error the best angle of attack for thin and thick-skinned vehicles. On the bombing ranges you will obtain a proficiency previously thought impossible. You will set a standard for the pilots in your squadron, a standard that you must demand that they in turn attain. You will keep up the highest traditions of the Royal Air Force." With the spring, the new techniques were put into practice. On D-Day -60, 66 Squadron bombed a site in a wood near Abbeville. The pilots learned later that it was a launch ramp for the V-1 flying bombs, which would later begin cascading on London and the southeast. They went off on low-level sweeps, ranging beyond Paris, with orders to engage targets of opportunity, and escorted bombers attacking railway junctions. At the end of May, they struck at radar stations in the Pas-de-Calais, part of an ongoing effort that would end with the destruction of all 6 long-range scanners south of Boulogne, and the reduction of 4/5 of the enemy early warning and gun-laying capacity. The squadron was part of the 2nd TAF, which, together with the 9th USAF Force, could muster 2,434 fighters and fighter-bombers and about 700 light and medium bombers. They were reinforced by the might of Bomber Command. For the crews, the diversion away from pulverizing German cities onto tactical targets in France was welcome, bringing relief from their grim nightly routines and generating the feeling that they were making a palpable contribution towards victory. After some initial blustering, Harris accepted the new situation with reasonable grace and would turn out to be a reliable partner to the overlord armies. The invasion preparations marked a new and more positive phase of Bomber Command's war. On the night of the 5th and 6th of April, 144 Lancasters of 5 Group attacked and badly damaged an aircraft factory in Toulouse. The precision of the raid was in part due to the low-level marking carried out by a Mosquito flown by Leonard Cheshire, the innovative and apparently nerveless CO of 617 Squadron. For the next 2 months, British and American bombers hit railway targets, military bases, arms and ordnance factories, ammunition dumps, and as the date grew closer, coastal batteries and strongpoints. Despite improved accuracy, German reinforced concrete proved highly resistant to destruction, and on D-Day, damage to the seaward defences was less than the army commanders had hoped. Despite the steady plastering, enough infrastructure survived to make the American landing at Omaha Beach a bloody affair. On the 5th of June, the airmen learned that the prelude was over. The ground crews broke off their normal duties to paint broad black and white stripes around their Spitfire's wings. The livery would let troops on the ground and trigger-happy gunners on ship or shore, who even at this stage in the war would reflexively fire at anything that appeared overhead, know that the machine above was friend, not foe. The stripes were an unintentional symbol of dramatically changed circumstances, the difference between night and day. The last time British troops had been in action in France was in June 1940, falling back on the beaches of Dunkirk before an unstoppable enemy under a sky that to their eyes the RAF appeared to have vacated. Now they were returning, and no soldier would be able to claim that the Air Force had let them down. The victory that followed was a feat of coordination and cooperation involving all arms, but it was only possible because of the Allies' command of the air, a fact that was now apparent to all. At last, air power had been accepted not as an adjunct to the efforts of troops on the ground or ships at sea. It was the ingredient that determined success or failure. Next to Dwight Eisenhower in the Allied command structure stood the RAF officer who had done more than anyone else to embed this reality in British military thinking. Arthur Tedder first met Ike in North Africa late in 1942, and soon took a professional liking to him. The feeling was mutual, and in time the shared regard developed a human dimension. Tedder's outward amiability masked a temperament that was chilly, sharp, and reserved. His feelings for his chief were unusually warm, and he chose him as his best man when, after his first wife Rosalind was killed in a plane crash, he married the vivacious and independent-minded Marie Toppy Black. She shared his affection for the American, writing to her mother, "I like Ike so much. He is a dear, honest-to-God, straight good man, and a very good friend of ours." They were excellent partners for a fraught task. The Allies' outward similarities masked acute differences in outlook, approach, and the ultimate objectives that lay beyond immediate war aims. They were managing a team that included some monstrous egotists, led by Montgomery for the British and Patton for the Americans. Handling national and personal sensitivities required Olympian tact and iron self-control. Both men possessed them, and although the ride was often rocky, their mastery of alliance diplomacy made a crucial contribution to victory. In January 1944, Tedder and Conyngham were recalled to Britain to join Eisenhower for the countdown to D-Day. They brought with them enormous experience, the glow of victory, and a shared outlook. The nature of the air war fought through North Africa, Sicily, and Italy had to some extent been formed by Coningham's ideas and leadership. In February 1943, he was given command of the British and American tactical forces in Tunisia. The team carried the Allies through the expulsion of the Axis forces from Tunisia, the Sicily landings, and the invasion of Italy. At every stage, lessons were learned, and technologies and tactics were refined that would be applied triumphantly in the next stage of the air war. On D-Day, 171 squadrons roamed over the troops toiling ashore. The almost total lack of opposition meant they were barely needed, and hopes faded for a decisive first-day battle that would wipe the Luftwaffe from the skies. When the dusk fell, the bag was a paltry 12 Junkers 88s. On the 10th of June, tactical support and air cover units began to move across the Channel. Waiting for them at Sainte-Croix-sur-Mer was an airfield thrown together from portable components by the RAF Servicing Commandos and Airfield Construction Branch wings. By the time the Normandy campaign was finished, there would be 31 in the British zone and 50 in the American area of operations, most of them constructed under fire. For Britain-based ground crews who manned the invasion force bases, Normandy would bring a dramatic change to their routines. Harry Clift, an armourer with 175 Squadron, arrived by Dakota on the morning of the 17th of June. They touched down at airstrip B5 at Le Fresne-Camilly, northwest of Caen. Before landing, they were told to unload as quickly as possible, and then carry aboard a party of wounded who would be lying on stretchers by the runway. The aircraft threw up clouds of dust, alerting the German 88mm gunners who opened fire on the runway. He and his comrades scrambled out and flung themselves to the ground, much to the amusement of the wounded. The shells landed 100 yards away, and they were assured by the veterans that they would soon get used to it. After that, we only dropped to the ground for the close ones and ignored the others. In sunny weather, by no means constant in a summer of freakish cloud and rain, the thick dust, a compound of limestone and powdered dirt, was a menace. Each takeoff and landing would send it swirling round the airfield, forcing the armourers to swathe their heads in scarves and shield their eyes with anti-gas goggles to protect them from the blast from the propellers. It worked its way into the 20mm cannon, causing many stoppages and clogging the air intake system of the Merlin engines, so that the desert filters from North Africa had to be fitted. The problem would eventually be reduced by laying bitumen-coated strips on the runways and spraying them with water at night. Life was tough for the crews, working all the hours of daylight, subject to frequent shelling and strafing, sleeping in tents, or at least trying to, against a constant background roar of aircraft and artillery. There were many compensating satisfactions, and the 175 Squadron armourers could watch our Typhoons take off, form up over the sea, fly inland to the target, dive onto the target, release their rockets, pull out of the dive, and circle the strip ready to land. It gave us the feeling that we were personally involved in the attack. The pilots provided a running commentary on the progress of the battle. Sometimes the ground crews made their own direct contribution. At Le Frazen-Camilly, exasperated at the attentions of the Luftwaffe, who would shoot them up on their way back to their bases after attacking the beachhead, they made a gun pit out of sandbags and installed twin Browning 303s. One day they brought down a marauding Focke-Wulf 190. For once there was a feeling that further up the chain the effort was appreciated. One day they received the ultimate accolade. "We were told to smarten up and gather at the side of the runway," Clift recalled. "When we arrived there we found a large crowd of all ranks who, like us, were wondering what it was all about. After a while, a light aircraft landed and rolled to a stop nearby. In the rear cockpit was Winston Churchill, who stood up, gave us a pep talk, telling us how he and everyone back home were thinking of us, and how proud they all were at the way we were fighting the enemy." Harry Clift would go all the way to Germany, but it was the first weeks that struck most vividly in his mind. It was hard work. We were in danger most of the time, but we had an important job to do, and we were allowed to get on with it without interference or red tape. In those early days, we found a feeling of camaraderie between all ranks which was to stay with us throughout the campaign. Among the British pilots were many who had been fighting since the beginning of the war. They could remember the daunting odds, the scant resources, the desperation and the exhaustion of the Battle of Britain. Now there was a lavish supply of aeroplanes and pilots, and the only shortage was the paucity of enemies to come up and fight. For some, Normandy was an opportunity to pay off old scores. Geoffrey Page had bailed out over the Channel in August 1940. He was badly burned when they picked him up, and spent the next 2 years at Queen Victoria Hospital, East Grinstead, where he was one of the pioneering plastic surgeon Archibald Mackindow's guinea pigs, undergoing multiple operations. Sometimes the orderlies would push the patients out onto the hospital lawn, where they watched Spitfires on their way to sweeps over northern France. "How my heart yearned to be one of them, not just a burnt cripple," he wrote. "I made a bitter vow to myself that for each operation I underwent, I would destroy one enemy aircraft when I returned to flying." He overcame many bureaucratic obstacles to get a chance to fulfill this promise, and in June arrived in France at the head of 132 Squadron. Initially, he was disappointed by the Luftwaffe's absence and had to content himself shooting up targets of opportunity on the ground. Although he exulted in the sight of my cannon shells ripping into the lurching vehicles as they careened about the narrow Normandy lanes like stricken animals. My lust lay in the desire to destroy enemy aircraft. Then one day, while on a test flight with another pilot 30 miles behind the enemy lines, he got his chance, running into a formation of 30 Me-109s near Lisieux. Despite the odds, he plunged to attack. In the dogfight that followed, Page was hit by a cannon shell and wounded in the leg. The red mist cleared. He dived to treetop level and, pulling out, looked round to see only a lone Messerschmitt was now dogging him. Hatred brought with it a new strength, he wrote. His opponent pulled up the nose of his aircraft to get enough deflection on his target. The move was fatal. Already on the point of stalling when the pilot opened fire, the recoil slowed the aircraft sufficiently to flick over and strike the trees 20 feet below. Circling the funeral pyre, I watched the column of black smoke rising with morbid fascination. For Pierre Clostermann, Normandy represented a further opportunity to restore the honour of France. He was a diplomat's son with family roots in Alsace and Lorraine, who was studying aeronautical engineering at California Institute of Technology at the start of the war. Before he could return home, France had fallen. He made a circuitous journey to England and after training joined 1st 341 Alsace Squadron before transferring to 602 Squadron, where he flew Spitfires over France. 5 days after D-Day, he set foot again in his homeland. The squadron was told to overnight at the landing ground at Bazonville, just south of the British landing beaches. He and his friend Jacques Remlinger were given the honour of putting down first and dressed for the occasion in their best dark blue uniforms. The great moment was a letdown. They landed in a cloud of dust which penetrated everywhere, darkened the sky, suffocated us. For 500 yards round the landing strip, all green had disappeared. Every growing thing was covered by a thick layer, stirred by the slightest breeze. Their first night was interrupted by the drone of a twin-engine aircraft and the swish of a falling bomb. I dived under a lorry. The earth quivered. A burning gust of air slapped our faces, and glowing splinters bespattered the tent, the trees, and the lorry, and bounced back sizzling on the dew-covered grass. Like the German army, the Luftwaffe used what resources they had to great effect. The narrow bridgehead behind the landing beaches was so choked with troops, ammunition dumps, concentrations of armour and aircraft that, as Clostermann said, they could scarcely fail to score a bull practically every time. The greatest hazards faced by Allied pilots in Normandy were the expertly operated 20mm light flak guns that protected airfields and the 88mm anti-tank guns of the infantry. After the initial avoidance of air-to-air combat, the Germans did come up to fight, sometimes with devastating effect. The Luftwaffe, though, had no hope of turning the battle. Their enemy overwhelmed them in every department. The first units ashore arrived with radar systems and mobile air-to-ground control posts, allowing commanders to request airstrikes, which most of the time materialized. Conyngham pressed on with the methods he had developed in North Africa and Italy. The essential challenge of close air support was how to concentrate firepower on tactical targets in the shortest possible time. Coningham's solution was the cab rank system. It involved placing an air controller with the advancing troops who could call on permanent air patrols loitering on the edge of the battle zone. The aircraft would carry a list of pre-arranged objectives, but could be switched immediately if required to targets of opportunity or to relieve an immediate threat. In Normandy, the system reached its apotheosis, finally fulfilling the devastating potential of air-armour fusion glimpsed on the battlefields of the Western Front a generation earlier. On the road to Berlin, the Brown Jobs and the Brillcream boys marched side by side. On the British side, the new methods were incarnated in the muscular form of the Hawker Typhoon. For the Americans, it would be the P.47 Thunderbolt, loved by every Allied foot slogger, dreaded and hated by his German foe. The Tiffy was a speedier, deadlier descendant of the fighter command stalwart of the Battle of Britain. Its development had been marred by technical setbacks, and initially it earned a reputation among pilots as a killer when put into a dive. By the summer of 1944, it was the perfect machine for the campaign, capable of 400 miles an hour and packing firepower that made the 8 Browning .303 caliber machine guns of the 1940 Hurricane seem like pea-shooters. According to Harry Clift, a typical armament load consisted of 4 boxes of 20mm ammunition. Each box contained a belt of 140 rounds, made up alternatively of 2 high-explosive and 2 armor-piercing incendiary shells throughout the belt. Next came 8 rocket motors weighing 20 pounds each, already fitted with fins and saddles by the armourer's assistants working at the bomb dump. Screwed into each was a 60-pound high-explosive warhead. The rockets were mounted on rails under the wings and fired electrically. A newsreel commentary claimed one Tiffy could deliver the equivalent of a destroyer's broadside, and just one missile could transform a tank into a hunk of glowing metal. The Germans received their first taste of what fighter bombers could deliver at dawn on D-Day +1. The Panzer Lehr division was caught as it moved forward in 5 columns from Alençon, 85 miles south of the beachhead. The attacks went on all morning. Before they had even sighted the invasion forces, they had lost 90 supply lorries, 40 fuel trucks, 84 half-track fighting vehicles, and several 88mm guns. Only 5 days after the landings, Rommel reported to Field Marshal Keitel that the enemy has complete control of the air over the battle area, up to a distance of about 100 kilometers behind the front, which immobilizes almost all traffic by day on roads or in open country. In the country behind, all roads are exposed to continual air attack, and it is therefore very difficult to bring up the necessary supplies of fuel and munitions. Generals were as vulnerable as everyone else. On the 17th of July, Rommel's staff car was caught in the open by a Spitfire of 412 Squadron, a Canadian unit. Rommel was badly wounded and invalided back to Germany, never to return to the battlefield. The defenders were under attack on sea as well as land. The attempt by U-boats to stem the flow of men and logistics across the Channel exposed them to the attentions of Coastal Command, which in 4 days following D-Day attacked 25 submarines, sinking 6 of them. The picture on the ground was rather different. The continuing inability of the British to take Caen prompted Lee Mallory, 8 days after the invasion, to suggest a raid by light and heavy bombers to unfreeze the situation. The tactical use of heavies had been tried before in February, during the Battle of Monte Cassino in southern Italy, when American bombers dropped 1,400 tons of bombs on a hilltop monastery overlooking the Allies' route to Rome. The attack achieved little. There were no troops on hand to follow up, and German paratroopers moved into the rubble to establish strong defensive positions. The proposal was rejected by Tedder, apparently on the grounds that Lee Mallory was trespassing on Conningham's area of responsibility. Bomber Command and the U.S. Strategic Air Force were anyway opposed to the operation, fearing the front lines were too close and accuracy too questionable to prevent friendly casualties. 3 weeks later, with the capture of Caen no nearer, Montgomery grabbed at Lee Mallory's plan. On the 7th of July, AEAF HQ at Stanmore in Middlesex discussed a request for Bomber Command to blast a path for a renewed assault by carpet-bombing the northern approaches to Caen. Tedder, who had been leading the criticism of Monty, disliked the development, believing it could encourage continual army requests for heavy bomber support, diverting them from more pressing duties, but did not object. In 1 hour, on the late evening of the 7th of July, 457 Bomber Command aircraft dropped 2,363 tons of bombs on northern Caen. The effect was spectacular, but the results relatively insignificant. 2 days of bitter fighting followed, resulting in the capture of half the city, but the bombardment seems to have brought few advantages, apart from boosting morale. There was no proper coordination between air and ground, and though the defenders were shaken up, few were killed. Showing the same fanatical determination that would mark every stage of the German retreat, they fell back to positions on the south of the city to block any further advance, and the strategic position remained the same. Despite the disappointing results, Montgomery gave a wildly optimistic account of the episode, and British and American heavy bombers launched 6 further massive air raids before German resistance in Normandy cracked. The risk to civilians was obvious. About 3,000 French men, women and children were killed in Caen alone between the 6th of June and the 19th of July. The French historian Henri Amoureux put the civilian death toll for the campaign at more than 50,000. The bombs had the same effect on French towns as they did on German ones. About 75% of the fabric of Caen, ancient churches, university and all, were demolished by the attacks. Nor were the liberating troops spared from the inevitable inaccuracies. The preparatory bombardment for Operation Cobra, the American attack on Saint-Lô at the end of July, killed about 100 GIs and wounded another 500. The effort was an attempt to break out of the cramped hedge and lane bocage of the Cherbourg Peninsula and into the easier country to the south, where the U.S. divisions could sweep west to secure the ports of Brittany and east towards Paris. The massive air assault of the 25th of July, involving 1,500 heavy bombers dropping 3,400 tons of bombs, opened the first big cracks in the German defences. In early August, the U.S. Third Army under Patton had secured Brittany and was ready to swing back to join the First Army, which was now moving eastwards. The end was hastened by a typical intervention from Hitler. Viewing events from his retreat at Berchtesgaden, he perceived the desperate situation as a unique, never-recurring opportunity for a complete reversal of the situation. He ordered panzer units in Normandy into a counterattack to recapture the neck of the Cherbourg Peninsula and cut off American forces in Brittany. The German Seventh Army moved forward to be enveloped by the advancing Americans as British and Canadian forces moved in behind them. The trap they were caught in would become known as the Falaise Pocket. On the 13th of August, Hitler finally accepted reality and gave permission for a fallback to the Seine. The Germans attempted an orderly retreat, delaying their departure, when on the 17th they took to the roads leading east and northeast from Falaise. They made a terrible rendezvous with the predators of the 2nd TAF. The retreat was spotted by Wing Commander Charles Green, who reported back to Harry Broadhurst, commanding 83 Group, that he was so low I could see not only the black crosses on the vehicles, but the square heads of the drivers. The weather prevented operations that morning, but the fleeing Germans came under continuous attack. The official history recorded that, as evening fell, pilots were greeted with a display of white handkerchiefs and cloths waved by despairing drivers. No notice was taken of this attempt to surrender. None of our land forces was anywhere in the neighbourhood to round up the would-be prisoners, and to cease fire would merely have allowed the enemy to move unmolested to the Seine. The debris became a war tourist attraction in the days ahead. Airmen had the unusual experience of witnessing the effects of their efforts. Stanley de Vere set off from Falaise, hoping to find an abandoned vehicle for the squadron's use. He was out of luck. The road east to Train, he recorded in his diary, was littered with wrecks, nearly all burned out and some not recognizable as vehicles at all. Beyond Train, he saw mounds of dead horses pressed into service as artillery transport when petrol ran out, and the bodies of Germans began to make an appearance. The sight and smell of these dead Germans didn't worry me much more than if they were horses, really. In a village he came across a jerry tank with a body lying over the top of the trek, its head and arms hanging down and altogether looking a horrible sight, with eyes and mouth gaping and skin quite black. Many vehicles had taken to side roads and farm tracks in a futile attempt to avoid their fate. A witness who was forced to detour because the main road was impassable found cars of every description, many of them Citroëns, Renaults, and other French makes, strewed the fields, mingled with horses dead in the shafts of stolen carts, and even old-fashioned traps of 2 generations ago. He noticed one up-to-date limousine, painted with the stippled green and brown camouflage affected by the Germans. It contained on the back seat a colonel and his smartly dressed mistress. Each had been shot through the chest with cannon shells. Further on, in a leafy lane, was a mile-long traffic jam from which all life was extinct. At its head and tail were a smashed-up armoured car. Each vehicle had been hit by rockets. Grey-clad, dust-powdered bodies were sprawled everywhere, propped against trees, flopped over driving seats or running boards. Pilots flying over the scene the following day reported that, even at 15,000 feet, the stench of death reached their nostrils. The carnage in the lane bore the hallmarks of a classic typhoon attack, in which the lead and rear vehicles were rocketed first to immobilize the column, which could then be annihilated systematically. There was no escape. Harry Clift recorded that at this phase of the fighting, the Typhoon's payload was arranged so that half the rockets were an anti-personnel type, to explode at ground level and deal with the crew. If any survivors tried to escape by running through the cornfields, they left a trail which could easily be seen from the air. Then they were strafed with cannon fire. The fugitives were harried every yard of the way. Sweeping over the small bands of escapees, Geoffrey Page found his anger turning to pity. At first he revelled in the pursuit. When he came across a group of arrogant German soldiers sitting outside on a farmhouse steps playing cards, he stopped their game with a few hundred rounds of bullets, and their arrogance disappeared rapidly. Then he met a man who will haunt me to my dying day. He calculated that by now he had probably killed several hundred people, but from the air it was completely impersonal and made no mental impact. When out on a hunt for German aircraft, he saw a small cloud of dust rising, revealing a motorbike and rider. He went down to investigate and saw the bike was camouflaged and the rider wore uniform, a legitimate military target. As I placed the orange reflected dot of my gun sight on the centre of his body, he looked straight up at me, and I knew that the moment of truth had arrived, he wrote. As I stabbed the gun button, he threw up his left arm as if to shield his face from the impact. I cursed him for making such a simple, pathetic human gesture, and loathed myself as I saw man and bike disappear in a torrent of bullets. I returned to base and found it difficult to talk to anyone for several days. I can still see his face and the raised arm. The 2nd TAF averaged 1,200 sorties a day for 10 days, turning defeat into headlong retreat. On the 25th of August, the German garrison in Paris surrendered. The pent-up force of the Allied advance broke free, falling on the backs of the retreating Germans. The pursuers could barely keep up with them. On the 3rd of September, the 5th anniversary of the outbreak of war, Stanley de Vere had gone down with food poisoning. The rest of the squadron was sent off that morning, and he wandered down to the flight office to find how they were faring, to hear that they were... Chapter 15. The Hyacinths of Spring. For the tactical Air Force squadrons keeping step with the advance across Europe, there was plenty of work, bombing and strafing, but ample time off to enjoy the pleasures and privileges accorded to the liberators. Everywhere they were swamped with gratitude. Paddy French was in a small party sent on a recce to Lille to see if the airfield was fit for occupation by 66 Squadron. It was. Having sent a message to HQ, they decided we would smarten up and go into the town. As they got ready, they heard sounds outside and found it was the local people starting to gather. There was much handshaking and shouts of Vive la France and Vive l'Angleterre. We eventually got away and drove into town where we were mobbed. We were eventually rescued by the police. John Rolfe of the RAF regiment wrote to his friend Joan Durnford in Cheshire, describing the reception given to his armoured car unit when it arrived in Ghent early in November, with people standing at their doors and cheering, waving and blowing kisses, all very embarrassing. Later he found the poor devils are pathetically anxious to make friends and practically fight each other to give you things they're so grateful. The gratitude could become oppressive. Stanley de Vere's Kiwi amiability was tested by a young Frenchman from Lille who took to dropping in on the squadron. "He's been coming to our quarters to speak to us, bringing cakes, fruit and tomatoes, etc.," he confided to his diary on the 4th of October. "It's really very kind of him. The trouble is he seems to come almost every day and stays a long time talking incessantly. We haven't had the heart to tell him to scram." These gifts involved sacrifice. Rolf reported that the Belgians were very short of food, pitifully so. Coal is terribly short. It was literally true that a tablet of soap, a bar of chocolate, or even 20 cigarettes will get you anything. Yet for all the privations, the people will never ask you for anything for services rendered. They just want to be friends. De Vere and his comrades were probably too modest to see what heroic figures they cut in the eyes of their Belgian admirers. They were young men like himself, who instead of having to endure the suffering and humiliation of defeat and occupation, were saviours whose skill, courage and sacrifice had lifted the terrible yoke. The ravages of life under the Germans were all too apparent. Paddy French noticed what looked like a graveyard next to the Lille airfield, and a few days later saw people digging there. A man spotted him and came over and told him that the plots contained the bodies of about 80 men, women and children, hostages murdered by the Germans a few months before. He took him over to one pit, and apart from the smell, it was a horrible sight. The bodies of 4 men with their hands tied behind their backs. The German appetite for destruction seemed insatiable. In Ghent, Rolf reported, "The sanitary arrangements leave much to be desired. From what I have learned, Jerry connected up the town's main water supply with the sewerage system, and then blew the whole lot sky high. A typical piece of German beastliness." The pilots took the opportunity to explore their new surroundings during the frequent downtime, before wining and dining at night. A sense that things were settling down was reinforced by the arrival of an inexorable visitor. When 66 Squadron moved to Grimbergen, near Brussels, base personnel were told to stand by to welcome Lord Trenchard. It can only be wondered what, if anything, his presence meant to the young men, many of them Norwegian aircrew. He seemed an old man, in the eyes of Paddy French, who Trenchard buttonholed for a few minutes, apparently relieved at finding a native English speaker among the throng of foreigners in Air Force Blue. The semi-domesticity of life could foster a false sense of security. The Germans were still capable of biting back. On the 3rd of November, with the squadron now based near Brussels, de Vere was tasked with a bombing and strafing attack on Klundert in southern Holland, where a German rearguard was holding up the advance. "We saw lots of planes over the town having their whack, and then we started on ours," he wrote in his diary that night, in an entry that reveals the extraordinary proximity that close air support could involve. "The flak was pretty intense and rather accurate, more than we had expected. I saw streams of it following close behind me several times. Noticed a large vehicle parked in the centre of town, so went down on it using guns and let my bomb go close by, hoping to damage some buildings where the Hun might be. Decided to give the vehicle another dose, so came round again and squirted more stuff into it, and the street and buildings round about. By the time I was at the bottom of the pull-out, I was a bit lower than a church steeple and passed close to it. Was thinking what a good thing it was I didn't fly into it, when there was a hell of a thumping bang and my eyes were full of glass splinters. A 20 or 30 millimetre shell had struck the windscreen and shattered it, leaving a hole about 6 inches in diameter. After a few seconds of furious blinking, I found I could see okay out of my right eye and fairly well out of the left, and both felt crammed full of this fine glass." He had a painful journey back to base, reflecting on how lucky I'd just been. 100th of a second later and the shell would simply have wiped my head off. The scale of the task still lying ahead became clear at the end of September at Arnhem. The Allied advance slowed drastically as supply lines lengthened and logistical difficulties multiplied. Resupply was made more difficult by the German strategy of leaving garrisons behind in the French Channel ports with orders to fight to the death. On the 4th of September, the British Second Army, with assistance from the local resistance, took Antwerp intact, but the Scheldt estuary on which it lay remained in German hands, so that the port facilities could not be exploited. Eisenhower was determined to maintain the Allied advance on a broad front, and urged Montgomery to break through to Antwerp. Monty had his own ideas. He proposed instead one really powerful and full-blooded thrust towards Berlin, commanded, naturally, by himself. It aimed to propel a large force across the waterways guarding the northern frontiers of Germany, thereby circumventing the man-made defences of the Siegfried Line, and catching the German army in a pincer movement. The crucial element was surprise, which was to be achieved by the landing of a huge airborne force to seize bridges over the rivers Maas, 2 branches of the Rhine, and several canals and tributaries. This was Operation Market. In Operation Garden, armoured forces would then drive north from Belgium to link up and pour across the captured bridges into Germany to take the Ruhr region, whose industries kept the German war effort alive. Largely in the interests of maintaining Allied harmony, Eisenhower agreed. Operation Market was the greatest air assault attempted to date. Taking part would be 34,600 men of the American 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, the British 1st Airborne Division, and the Polish Brigade. About 20,000 would jump into their landing zones. The rest would be towed there in gliders. A force of 1,438 Dakotas and 321 converted bombers, plus more than 3,000 gliders, was available. The swift adoption of Montgomery's plan meant preparations were rushed. It was originally sanctioned on the 10th of September for execution on the 14th, but on the 12th it was postponed until the 17th. Thus, the detailed planning took a week, compared to the months dedicated to preparing the airborne operations in Sicily and Normandy. The element of shock was diminished by the fact that there were still not enough resources to get all the troops on the ground on the first day, forcing a phased delivery. The opening moves of Market went well. The great majority of the troops reached their drop zones without meeting significant flak or fighters, and arrived where they were supposed to. The 1st Airborne Division's objective was the road bridge over the Niederrhein, the Nether Rhine, in the Dutch city of Arnhem, but the landing zone chosen required a significant march to secure it. The progress of the troops alerted the defenders. By the time they reached the bridge, they did not have the numbers to capture it. The heroic debacle that ensued dispelled hope that the war might be over by Christmas. The operation was described in enthralling detail by Sergeant Arthur Rigby, a member of the Glider Pilot Regiment. Its members were trained by the RAF but controlled by the Army, and fought alongside the men they transported. Rigby was disappointed to miss out on the D-Day glider operation, and had spent a frustrating summer in England. His account, written while fresh in his mind a few weeks after his capture, records that a number of airborne ops were scheduled and then abruptly cancelled during the period, for each time there was no time to mount it before the ground troops had overrun the ground, so rapid was the advance. His testimony reveals a high degree of training and competence on the part of the air crews that absolves them from any blame for the catastrophe. Rigby remembered a stir at the end of August at his base at Brize Norton, suggesting something was afoot. It was confirmed around the 10th of September, when the group was ordered to move to Manston on the North Foreland in Kent, in order to put their upcoming objective within range of their Albemarle tug aircraft. There they stayed for a week before the target was revealed. They would be transporting the men of the 1st Airborne Division to a landing zone, LZ, near Arnhem, then joining the operation to capture and hold the bridge until relieved. On the morning of Sunday the 17th of September, as the sun burned off the mist and with everyone in high spirits, they got ready for takeoff. Rigby and his co-pilot, Sergeant Ted Healy, were at the controls of their usual glider, an airspeed Horsa, 67 feet long with an 88-foot wingspan, which they nicknamed Droopy. They were carrying a 6-pounder anti-tank gun and 3-man crew, plus a jeep to tow it, as well as their own Bren gun, rifle, and ammunition. Marshals orchestrated the complex takeoff schedule, and at 10:40 a.m. it was their turn. The tug took up the slack on the tow rope, and the glider started to roll gently forward, to rapidly gain momentum, 20, 40, 60, 80, 85, 90, ease back on the column, and the old Droop came off the deck as smoothly as she always did. And we rose to about 50 feet and settled down at that height until the tug got airborne. And as she did just that, so we started gently to climb ahead of her rise, all very smoothly and gracefully. From the cockpit, the sky seemed literally full of aircraft, Dakotas, Sterlings, Albemarles, Horsa and Hamilcar gliders, and here and there Typhoon and Thunderbolt fighters sliding round like black and white minnows in a pool of pike. He was a little nervous crossing the coast, but it was only when they passed Nijmegen on their right that they saw the first puffs of flak, far away and ineffectual. Rigby handed the controls to Ted Healy to take charge of the landing while he cast off the tow rope. Then we were in free flight, heading towards the landing zone. Everything was quiet, other than the rushing sound of the wind as we swept on. No gunfire, nothing. They landed at 1:20 p.m. in what looked like a potato field in a cloud of dust that left them coughing and spluttering. The back of the Horsa unbolted. The jeep rolled off, they hitched up the gun and took their place in the column in the road next to the LZ. A Hamilcar came in too fast and flipped over, killing everyone on board. It was a routine tragedy, and did little to spoil the feeling that everything was going well. A little way away, parachute troops were floating down. The sky was full of them. Apart from the aircraft engines, there was not a sound, no gunfire. It was as if we'd landed in Holland completely unnoticed. It was 3 hours before the force was assembled and ready to move off. Half of the troops were to stay behind, together with the divisional HQ, to secure the landing zones and drop zones, DZs, for the second lift due the following day. That meant there were only about 700 men to tackle the objective. The LZs and DZs were 7 and in some cases 8 miles from Arnhem, well beyond the range of the HQ radios, which, it turned out, were tuned to the wrong frequencies. Eventually, the column set off, taking a road close to the Rhine, which led through the district of Oosterbeek. The weather seemed propitious. It was a perfect Sunday afternoon, sunny and warm and very suburbanly quiet. We passed some houses on the way, and there were men digging their gardens and mowing their lawns, just as though it was quite usual to have an entire airborne division drop in. Then people emerged from their houses, and it was like a royal progress. Men, women and children were standing along the pavements and in their front gardens, throwing posies of marigolds to us, giving us apples and bottles of wine, shouting, "Welcome, welcome, 4 years we have waited," shaking our hands. Little boys ran along with us, their faces shining. Oosterbeek was a few kilometres west of Arnhem. It stood on the high ground at the edge of fields that sloped away to the Rhine a mile or two away. A steel cantilevered railway bridge ran across it. They paused while a party of Royal Engineers set off to deal with any demolition charges. They had only gone a very short time when the crackle of rifle and machine guns drifted across the fields. Then there was a tremendous roar. Epilogue. Brothers and sisters. On the damp Saturday afternoon of the 8th of June, 1946, the crowds packing the Mall in London for the first anniversary of Victory in Europe celebrations looked up as the air filled with the rumble of aero engines sounding from the east. Out of the dishcloth grey clouds a small shape appeared over Admiralty Arch and flashed past to disappear into the murk above Buckingham Palace. The blunt outlines of a hurricane were instantly recognisable, an enduring symbol of the guts and skill that had won the Battle of Britain. It was followed by a stream of 306 aeroplanes, large and small, each type reflecting an aspect of the air war. There were Sunderlands from Coastal Command, 12 Lancasters from 35 Squadron of Bomber Command, and Spitfires, then Mosquitoes and Beaufighters, the jacks of all trades of the Air Force, Fireflies and Seafires of the Fleet Air Arm. After 20 minutes, the propeller throb was drowned out by the roar of jet engines. The crowds barely had time to register the sleek forms of the new Meteors and Vampires of Fighter Command before they had vanished. Less than a year after the end of the war, the aircraft that had won it already belonged to a rapidly receding past. The commanding place of air power and the Royal Air Force in the story, though, was already assured. The squadrons had been in action every day of the conflict, often in conjunction with the Army and Navy, but much of the time on their own. Victory was the work of many, soldier, sailor, airman, and civilian, but though they did not make the claim themselves, the Air Force can fairly be said to have made the most significant contribution. It was Fighter Command which, in the summer of 1940, kept Britain in the war, creating the essential conditions for a landing in northwest Europe and the ultimate defeat of Germany. It was Bomber Command that had led the fight back, taking the war to Germany by the only means available and slowly dismantling its ability to make war. If not for Coastal Command, the struggle to keep the sea lanes open would have been lost and Britain starved into submission. Without the efforts of all arms of the Air Force and the alliance with the USAAF, the invasion of Normandy might have been much bloodier and the march to Berlin a great deal longer. During the conflict, air power had become inextricably fused with action on land and sea, and superiority over the enemy in the air accepted as the essential prerequisite for success. In the course of the war, the RAF had grown gigantically. In May 1945, it numbered 1,079,835 men and women, compared with the 173,958 it had started out with, and 9,200 aircraft compared with the frontline strength of 1,911 at the beginning. A tight, white, socially restricted elite had burgeoned into a heterodox host of nationalities, races drawn from every milieu. The force had expanded to fill the ravenous demands of the war, and when it ended, much of the organization became redundant. At the same time, the factors that had shaped its evolution altered dramatically. The last act of the conflict seemed to spell the end of the era of total warfare and the opening of a new age that required a new air force. On the 6th of August, the first atomic bomb burst over Hiroshima, followed 3 days later by one on Nagasaki, ending the war with Japan. With the coming of the Cold War, Britain and America would henceforth base their national security on a policy of deterrence, with fleets of long-range nuclear bombers at its heart. The process of dismantling a vast force took time. For most airmen, demobilization could not come fast enough. As bomber boy Eric Banks observed, whatever their RAF experiences, they remained civilians at heart. Respect for the force, pride in its achievements, and gratitude for the friendships forged along the way notwithstanding, they still had no interest whatsoever in the peacetime pursuits of the service. The slow rate of demobilization was resented, particularly overseas, where many had served for years without seeing home or loved ones. In January 1946, a wave of strikes rippled across bases in India and the Far East. Hundreds of ground staff downed tools in protest at the slow rate of repatriation. The factory spirit, feared by Ludlow Hewitt in his reports on discipline as Inspector General, lay dormant in the wartime service. With the overwhelming Labour victory in the 1945 general election, a result which the forces vote had done much to bring about, the trade union ethos was everywhere in the ascendant. The RAF's internal report into the disaffection tried to blame the trouble on a well-organized minority of troublemakers and claimed that the episodes had caused a serious loss of prestige to the junior service at a time when it was universally recognized that air power had been one of the deciding factors in World War II. From the accounts of those involved in the protests, it seems more like the justifiable frustration of patriotic men who had kept their side of the bargain and simply wanted to go home. On the morning of the 22nd of January 1946, flight mechanic R.J. Adams and his crewmates reported for duty at the Moripur base outside Karachi to find everything was dead quiet. On learning that a strike was underway, they set off back to their tents, but were overtaken by the engineering officer in a jeep who asked them where they were going. "Back to the camp, sir," said we. "We're on strike." I'm sure had he insisted we would have gone back, but he said, "OK then." He did not make things unpleasant as he could have done. Indeed, there was no unpleasantness at any time during the strike. It was a strange situation for us all. We had been subject to military discipline for years, and we knew what we were doing was really mutiny. The protest was led by NCOs, none of them pre-war regulars, but seems to have had the sympathy of the officers on the spot. According to Adams, the organisation and management was nothing less than brilliant. Everything had been thought through and acted upon superbly. The leaders knew very well that Moripur was an essential link in the airline route, operating eastwards from Cairo and on to Singapore, and even a short closure could bring chaos. After 3 days, and fervent assurances from visiting senior officers and leading figures in Air Command Southeast Asia that grievances would be addressed, the strike was called off, mostly with no consequences for the ringleaders. The other protests were similarly dealt with. The episode was perhaps to be expected. The men on strike were skilled, self-confident, and proud. They had accepted service customs and discipline for the duration of hostilities, but they had never lost their aversion to bullshit. The slow pace of the demobilization and repatriation program seemed exactly that. The RAF had no interest in preserving the more flexible character of the citizen Air Force, and was anxious to return as soon as possible to its pre-war professional identity. The attitude was apparent in ways that were small but revealing. While the war was on, many bases held dances at which all ranks were welcome. Previously, the practice had been for officers to attend NCOs or airmen's parties by invitation only, and then to stay for only a short time. The trend towards more democratic socializing had been noted anxiously by the ever-vigilant Ludlow Hewitt, who warned that though we have to remember that today we have a citizen Air Force, the matter still required careful consideration. After discussion, it was decided to let the dances continue. After the war, the Director General of Personnel, Dermot Boyle, summed up the new mood by stating that though they had served a very necessary and useful purpose in wartime, it was now common ground that all ranks dances are to be deprecated, since they may lead to the inescapable barriers, however intangible they may be, between different ranks being broken down too far, with the result that discipline might suffer. Ludlow Hewitt's strictures seemed tinged with nostalgia for the pre-war era. But it was in this broadened phase of the RAF's life, when Tom, Dick and Harry, Joan, Kath and Betty flooded into its ranks, that it lived its hour of greatest glory. Its deeds and triumphs, great and small, were largely the achievement of the birds of passage, and it was the image they created that fired the imagination of Britain and the world. By 1945, everyone knew about the RAF. Fighter Command's victory in the summer of 1940 was famous not merely as a military success, but as a triumph of the spirit, and the brave, apparently carefree young pilots were the embodiment of the values they were willing to die for. With Bomber Command, the picture was more complicated. Their achievements soon came to be questioned on the grounds of both utility and morality. The RAF's own post-war survey showed that until the last period of the campaign, the spectacular destruction meted out had not had quite the devastating effect on industrial production that had been expected. The conclusion drawn by some critics that the strategic bombing campaign was a massive waste of life and effort was, however, inaccurate and unjust. The bomber cult that shaped pre-war development, misguided though it seems in hindsight, made sense to many at the time, and once the commitment to strategic bombing was made, there was no real choice but to stick to the plan. Trial, error, and the acceleration of technology that always comes with war meant that by the end the prophecy was fulfilled. In the judgment of the official historians, whose 4-volume account of the history treated Harris and the bomber zealots with admirably stern detachment, both cumulatively in largely indirect ways, and eventually in a more immediate and direct manner, strategic bombing made a contribution to victory which was decisive. The charge that the huge civilian casualties resulting from area bombing amounted to an Allied war crime came later, in time to trouble the old age of brave men who had not welcomed war and had no say in how it was conducted. Kelso Robinson was unusual in admitting to nagging doubts about the morality of what I was doing during his tour of operations in 1944-45, which included the raid on Dresden. However, he fairly easily assuaged my conscience by reflecting that what we were doing was carrying out the policy of the highest in the land, and supported almost completely by the public at large. Looking back half a century later, he wrote, "I do not think my viewpoint has changed. In spite of the horror, the indiscriminate killing and maiming, I think the bombing policy was probably right. War is horrible. Once a nation has become involved in a war, it is the responsibility of the political leaders and commanders to win as quickly as possible and with minimum casualties to their own side. It's not possible to fight and win a war under some kind of Marquis of Queensberry rules." If the man who directed the policy and pressed on with it, even when Churchill's enthusiasm cooled, had any qualms, he kept them to himself. What went on behind Peter Portal's hooded eyes would remain his secret. It was not necessary to penetrate his thought processes to appreciate his brilliance. The youngest of the wartime service chiefs, he was the coolest and shrewdest, the unflappable opposite of hot-tempered Allenbrook, apparently inexhaustible when Dudley Pound was visibly flagging. These qualities would be much needed in his dealings with his peers. As late as the summer of 1942, he was still fending off Army and Navy efforts to bend the Air Force to their wills. The Royal Marine General, Sir Leslie Hollis, who observed him in conference with the Chiefs of Staff, never saw him ruffled, even under vicious and uninformed attacks on the Air Force. He would sit surveying the critic coldly from beneath his heavy-lidded eyes, never raising his voice or losing his temper, but replying to rhetoric with facts. Portal was the best chief the service could have hoped for, and among the men he presided over were several superbly suited to their place and time. Tedder, Dowding, and Harris were very different men. They seemed granite figures now, terrifying in their certainty. What they shared was a certain clairvoyance and the enormous energy and self-belief needed to push their vision through the thickets of the decision-making process and make it a reality. Their service was well rewarded. They ended up heaped with honours bestowed by Britain and her grateful allies. Portal had already been made a Marshal of the Royal Air Force in January 1944. In August 1945 he became a Baron, and in January 1946 a Viscount, as well as being awarded the Order of Merit to join the row upon row of silverware that jangled on his chest. For the mass of those who served, their reward was their memories. The war diverted them from a course whose direction was largely set by their background and education, taking them down unexpected paths and into unusual company. "I quite enjoy the idea of not knowing what will happen to me," wrote Betty Bullard in her diary 11 days after the outbreak of war. Her career in the WAAF would bring responsibilities, adventures, and friendships that a woman of her background would never have experienced in peacetime. "Sergeant's party tonight, which I rather enjoyed," ran a typical entry a few years later. For women who had hitherto served only under men, Serving with them could prove a liberation and a validation of their worth. Sylvia Drake Brockman discovered a new self as a highly efficient WAF officer, as competent at giving orders as acting on them. In the RAF she found men who treated her as something approaching an equal. Among her papers is a letter she clearly cherished from Group Captain Peter Jones, the station commander at West Kirby, a dispatch centre for personnel going overseas, received after she had been posted away in his absence. "Dear DB," it read, "it was a shock to come back and find no wise woman to greet me. I shall miss you, and you must know that I have appreciated our talks together about all sorts of subjects." For hundreds of thousands of ordinary people, who in peacetime could expect only a small ration of excitement and fulfillment, war was the great opportunity. It swept away the restricted vistas of normal life, revealing possibilities that were unimaginable hitherto. Fred Dane, who fantasized about being an RAF pilot growing up in West London in the 1930s, remembered a moment when he was just completing his training at an OTU in Egypt. He wrote, "I was stooging around at 30,000 feet in clear blue empty sky, wallowing a little in the rarefied atmosphere, and admiring the magnificent view across to Ismailia, the Suez Canal, onto the Sinai Desert, and then to the minute curve of the earth on the far horizon. In that grand isolation, it occurred to me that had it not been for the war, instead of flying a Spitfire high over the desert of Egypt, I should probably be working at a bench in some dreary factory on the Perivale trading estate." The Second World War is lodged in our collective memory as the Good War. For all its contradictions, confusions, and bitter ironies, it was the closest thing to a clear-cut moral conflict that we are likely to see. The sense that the effort was being made in the name of decency permeates the testimony of the ordinary players in the struggle. Everyone who wrote anything about their war refers to a feeling of solidarity that incubated among people who in other circumstances would probably have never mixed, a sense that even in such socially stratified times, what combined people was greater than what separated them. For those in the front line, the camaraderie had a special quality that only they could feel, and which endured long afterwards. "I am a shy man," wrote Kelso Robinson, "but I can go to a meeting of former aircrew whom I do not know, and immediately feel at home. It's not that we talk about the war, but the sense of a shared, extraordinary experience gives us a feeling of common brotherhood." It was made more intense by the ghostly presence of the absentees. In all, 102,592 British, Dominion and Allied personnel were killed serving in the wartime RAF. Another 31,011 were wounded. The balance of casualties in favour of death reveals the thick layer of added hazard involved in fighting in aeroplanes. By choosing to serve in the air, they had identified themselves as adventurous and high-spirited, ready for challenges and thirsty for life. Just the people needed to build a new world from the rubble of the old.
Insignia on the conning tower when it was painted over with Lange's emblem, a large seashell. No, we thought Lange is definitely the right man for this job. We worked hard during the day, of course, but we were still determined to enjoy our remaining time in Lorient. During the day, farmers would come to the main gate and sell us bottles of home-brewed Calvados. At night, we took pleasure in the ruins of Lorient wherever we could find it. Drinks, an occasional girl, and unprovoked fights with the Luftwaffe made those days pass very quickly. Slogans frequently made their way through our crew, summing up our attitude toward life. The one that was favored during those days was, "A man only lives once, and then no more." It was an attitude toward life made logical by the desperate war situation we found ourselves in. On the 12th I was handed a bundle of mail from home. A few were flowery missives of love from girls I knew. The rest were letters from my mother. Inevitably they opened with verses from the Bible and ended with her asking if I still prayed as she had taught me to. Between the lines I could tell she was desperately worried about me. I did my best to reassure her that all was well and that we were confident of victory. There was no use in worrying her needlessly. One bit of news my mother told me was that 2 days after I passed through Marburg on my way back to base, the town had been savagely bombed by the Allies. The air raid obliterated the rail station and the train I would have been riding. If I had not been punished for my encounter with the doctor, I would have been there when the bombs hit. Another example of the remarkable good luck I experienced during the war. Other members of the crew, however, did not have such good luck during their furloughs. Many of them, especially those who visited Berlin, Frankfurt, and other large cities, spent most of their leaves huddled in air raid shelters. The stories they told of life under the shadow of Allied bombers were not pretty. The purpose of the bombing may have been to break our morale, but I can tell you that seeing the suffering being inflicted on our families and friends only inspired us to fight even harder. We worked like crazy during the next 2 weeks to get U-505 ready for her scheduled sailing date. Meanwhile, we watched the shipyard workers like hawks for any sign of sabotage. They sensed our obvious mistrust, and they developed a resentful attitude toward us because of it. We didn't mind one bit. Better safe than sorry. Starting on the 18th, we began loading our boat with torpedoes, provisions, and supplies. Some of the new guys in the crew, fresh out of submarine school, said that our boat smelled sweet like a whorehouse because of all the colibri perfume we sprinkled on our spare clothes and ourselves. "Wait until you have to empty the pail in the diesel room a few times," I told them. "You'll wish you still smelled like a hurrah after that." By the afternoon of the 19th we were ready to sail. We had the obligatory visits by flotilla officers, as well as a good-sized crowd of civilian well-wishers for our departure. We knew the French resistance had been using some of the local girls to extract information out of us. To avoid giving any useful intelligence to the enemy, we tried to feed the girls lies and misinformation regarding our boat's technical details and sailing date. Despite our precautions, however, there were a large number of mademoiselles waiting at the dock to see us off. Who knows? Perhaps one of us talked in his sleep. For whatever reason, the girls of Lorient always seemed to know as much about our sailing schedule as we did. Late on the afternoon of December 20th, we waved our caps and bade farewell to Lorient. Once our boat was clear of the pier, we increased our speed to 1/2 and headed for the mouth of the harbor. Heavy clouds hung overhead like giant gray cotton balls as we made our way towards open sea. When we reached the 200-meter depth line, we prepared to make our final test drive. Given our past experience with sabotage, there was a certain amount of anxiety as we slipped underneath the waves. 30 meters, 50 meters, 80 meters, everything all right so far. At 120 meters, however, we started to hear a suspicious noise. After another 10 meters, a gurgling sound began. A moment later, with a loud hiss, we began taking on water. We soon located the source of the leak, a faulty welding seam on a cable flange. More sabotage. Lange cursed the shipyard workers with every bad word in the sailor's rich dictionary of curses. There was no alternative but to return to port for more repairs. We dove one last time to see if there was anything else we should know about, and, discovering nothing else, headed for home. Within a couple of hours we were once again tied to our pier in Bunker Scorff. Most of the crew boarded buses for our barracks, but the board watch, me included, was left behind to tend the boat. Lange must have really raised hell with the shipyard officials, because 1/2 hour after we docked, a large group of workers came running on board like a bunch of whipped dogs. The repairs, they said, would take a few days to complete. Although we were frustrated with having yet another mission aborted by shoddy and/or malicious workmanship, we were not displeased with the prospect of spending the Christmas holiday in port. Our chief navigator, Alfred Reinig, who was also responsible for keeping the crew's pay records, told us that only 2 of the crewmen had any Reichsmarks left in their accounts. Luckily, he was able to convince the military bureaucrats in the finance department to give us an advance on our next pay. That little cash advance kept us afloat for the next few days while the repairs were completed. Afloat is an appropriate word, since virtually every pfennig was spent on liqueur to drink. At noon on December 24th, the day we call Holy Eve, we had a Christmas celebration sponsored by the flotilla. By order of our skipper, all drinking had to stop at midnight. We knew this meant that we would be sailing the next day, Christmas Day. 12 hours of feasting and drinking were enough, though, even for us. At midnight we turned into our bunks and tried to get some sleep. Sure enough, we departed Lorient the next day. With 3 minesweepers as escort, we sailed back to the 200-meter depth line. This time our test drive was performed without incident. But when we surfaced and started the diesels, the starboard engine burst into flame. It took us several harrowing moments to extinguish the smoky fire. Once the smoke and fumes had been blown out of the compartment, Lange ordered us to submerge to effect repairs. It wasn't until that evening that Diesel Chief Fricke reported that the repairs were complete. We all walked by the troublesome engine and spat on it for good luck before it was fired up for a test. The engine functioned just fine, and soon the diesels were singing their familiar hissing, hammering song as we knifed through the bay. After the batteries were fully recharged, we heard the skipper's unmistakable baritone voice on the intercom ordering the boat to dive. I was laying off duty in my bunk, listening intently to the sounds of our boat as it step by step slipped beneath the waves. When we heard the hiss, hiss, hiss of compressed air opening the relief valves on the diving tanks, we all reflexively braced ourselves so that we would not slip out of our bunks as the boat pitched downward. Within a few minutes we were cruising at a depth of 70 meters, the soft hum of the electric motors lulling us to sleep. We were awakened the next morning by the rush of cold air being sucked through the boat to the diesels. We threw on some thick sweaters and woolen caps and reported for duty. It was still a bit strange to enter the control room and see Lange instead of Czech as skipper, but everything we had seen so far convinced us that Lange was our man. He always smelled like cigarettes and often insisted on shooting the stars with the sextant himself. There was no doubt in our hearts and minds that this gruff old salt was exactly the kind of skipper we needed. The first few days of our passage through the Bay of Biscay passed uneventfully. The weather was typical for the winter, choppy waves and low, dark gray, overcast clouds. The temperature inside the boat plummeted as we moved further into a very frigid cold front. Around 1400 hours on the 28th, we started hearing the muffled boom of ship artillery and aircraft bombs exploding in the distance. The barrage continued unabated for more than 2 hours. After sundown, we cautiously surfaced to recharge the batteries. There was lots of radio traffic in the air, most of it enemy transmissions. At 1910 hours, we received an FT ordering 4 boats, including U-505, to proceed at top speed to C-square BE 6938. There was no explanation, but we assumed it had something to do with the gunfire we'd been hearing. Within minutes, we were smashing our way through the breakers at maximum speed, southeast toward our rendezvous point. Ice-cold spray drenched the bridge watch as they scanned the horizon for signs of battle. Tensions ran high among us crew members. We were very excited to get back into action. As we drew closer to our destination, we could plainly see flashes of gunfire. Just as we entered the designated C-square, however, the fire slackened and then died away completely. At 20:42 hours, we received a long FT from flotilla headquarters. It informed us that a group of our destroyers and fast torpedo boats had been battling a superior force of British warships located in C-square BE 6930. German destroyer Z-27 was dead in the water, location BE 3938. The 4 remaining destroyers were trying to fight their way westward. 6 of our torpedo boats were attempting to escape toward the east. We were ordered to render immediate assistance to destroyer Z-27 and to attack any enemy naval units we should encounter. A few minutes later, we received an update through FT. We were advised the enemy group consisted of cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft. Present location unknown. We were ordered to search for survivors from the Z-27, which implied the destroyer had sunk. Given the frigid temperature of the sea, we knew the men in the sea would not last long in the freezing water. We found ourselves shivering uncontrollably, half from the cold and half from the excitement. It had been a long time since we had gone into action, far too long for our tastes, and now a chance to tangle with warships. The glory of sinking an enemy cruiser filled our imaginations. Our first priority, however, was rescuing those boys from the Z-27. We entered our destination C-square in the early morning hours of the 29th. Sea conditions were becoming rougher with very poor visibility. Spotting survivors in this kind of weather would be quite a challenge, to say the least. With the size of the waves we were encountering, our only chance of finding them was if we spotted each other as we were both riding the crest of a swell. We were not optimistic. Nevertheless, we began gathering all of our woolen blankets while Tony brewed pot after pot of hot coffee. We prayed that we could save at least some of our sailors from the freezing water. At 01:40 hours, we spotted a red flare almost directly astern of our boat. We wheeled around and began a zigzag search pattern. A couple of hours later, we located 2 German sailors floating in pipe boats, one-man life rafts designed to help men survive winter sea conditions. The freezing cold swells made their retrieval very difficult, but we finally managed to fish them out of the water. They were slightly injured and very, very cold. They were having shivering fits from hypothermia, so we took them down to the electric engine room and stripped off their wet clothing. After rubbing them dry to help circulation, we gave them some dry clothing and put them into warm bunks. Meanwhile, the weather continued to deteriorate. A freezing north wind was whipping up, blowing the tops off the waves. Visibility from the bridge was virtually nil. To make matters worse, the motor malfunctioned on our Vanza device, our tiny new radar detector, further handicapping us. We were all thinking of the poor boys out there in that ice-cold water, and how small our chances were of finding any more of them before it was too late. Despite the dismal odds, Lange was up on the bridge, soaking wet and freezing cold, but he refused to give up on the men. We could see him standing there, smoking cigarette after cigarette, shouting orders over the roar of the wind. He was like the eye of a hurricane, a pillar of utter calm surrounded by the storm. More confirmation that he was a skipper we could be proud of. Our skipper also had a lot of confidence in us. After the war, Lange told me personally that he was very impressed with our professionalism. He never had a doubt that we were a well-trained and able crew, and was very happy he had us instead of a newly assembled crew. This is absolute refutation of the opinion of some writers that our spirit had been broken after the Czech affair, and that we should have been split up and dispersed as replacements to other boats. For the next hour we rumbled back and forth in zigzag search patterns. With 10-foot swells crashing over our upper deck, visibility was virtually zero. But there was no question of giving up. Up on the bridge, Lange and the rest of the watch crew strained their eyes to spot something through the darkness. Below decks, we continued to ready the boat for more survivors. We couldn't stop thinking of those poor boys out there, exposed to the freezing blasts of wind and sea. We prayed that God would put his thumb between them and the inevitable fate that awaits all sailors exposed to a winter ocean storm. Just before dawn, one of the bridge watch crew caught a quick glimpse of something being lifted above the whitecaps by the crest of a big wave. As we approached the spot, we could see a group of 7 life rafts tied together. Lange maneuvered our boats so that our conning tower sheltered the cluster of rafts in our lee. As we pulled alongside, we realized they were German sailors, more than 24 of them. They were in pitiful condition, hardly able to grab the tow line we tossed to them. One by one, we hauled the men on board. The last one to leave the life rafts was Korvettenkapitein Birk van Gortzen, skipper of torpedo boat T-25. Needless to say, he was very grateful to us for rescuing them. He told us his torpedo boat had been sunk by naval gunfire during a savage encounter with British cruisers. On our trip back to base, we learned it was his T-25 that had rescued the crew of one of our sister boats, U-106, when it was attacked by British aircraft in the Bay of Biscay earlier that year. We were happy to return the favor to our comrades in the Kriegsmarine. Everyone not on duty was detailed to helping the newly rescued men. Those fellows were in miserable shape. Several of them were deep in hypothermic shock. One of the biggest problems was finding space for them all. Since we had just left port, our decks were still piled high with provisions. There wasn't enough room on our sub for a dog to lay down. Despite the sardine can conditions, however, we tried to give the sailors the impression they were not in the way. Meanwhile, the weather continued to worsen. Our guests were not used to the motions of our boat and turned green. Spit pans were brought out, but most of them just threw up into the bilge. They were very apologetic for making such a mess, but we just tried to make a joke of it. "Don't worry about it," we assured them. "It just means our cook Tony will have an easy day today. He'll just collect it all and serve it tonight for stew. It'll save us from using our own rations." Rough sailor talk like that made them laugh and relax a bit. At 05:45 hours, we spotted a red star emergency flare off our port bow. Korvettenkapitein van Gortzen thought it might be some of his crew who had been separated from the others by the ferocity of the storm. Unfortunately, whoever fired the flare must have slipped beneath the waves by the time we reached him. Von Gartzen was beside himself with worry about the fate of his missing crewmen. Conditions were getting too rough on the surface to continue the search, so Lange ordered us down to 40 meters. Our passengers' eyes got wide as soup bowls when the boat tilted down and began slipping beneath the waves. They calmed down a bit when the boat leveled off, but a few of the sailors, already delirious from hypothermia, began to rant and panic. To keep them from hurting themselves or others, we were forced to carry them to the aft crew quarters and tie them up in hammocks. After an hour or so of warming up, most of them started acting normal again. Around 09:30, Lange brought us up to periscope depth to take another look around. Much to our disbelief, the weather had actually gotten worse since we submerged. The old man was looking through the periscope when we heard him growl, "Verdammte Tommies!" damned Tommies, and lowered the periscope in disgust. He told us we had just passed a large group of empty life preservers. The survivors had probably been chilled to unconsciousness and slipped through the arm straps, or had simply given up and decided to end their freezing misery. After a moment, Lange regained his composure and raised the periscope to once again resume the search. Nothing could be seen but the raging sea. Around noon, Tony served lunch. Our comrades from the T-25 got served first. After they had finished, the plates were scraped more or less clean, and we were served our food. Their hunger satisfied, the boys from the T-boat tried to find a place to lay down and sleep. Meanwhile, their exhausted skipper was still busy at the second periscope, assisting our skipper scan the sea for survivors. Lange finally convinced him to go down and get some rest. Before he laid down, however, Von Gartzen inspected the conditions of every one of his men. We could tell he was a good, caring skipper of a well-trained and disciplined crew. Just before sunset, we surfaced to take one last look around. As the skies started to darken, we spotted an emergency signal light off our port bow. The seas had decreased a bit, so we were able to make good speed toward the light. Our prow cut big, white, splashing wedges through the rollers as we raced ahead. Lange shouted down from the bridge, "Rettungskommando auf die Brücke!" Rescue crew to the bridge. The men scampered up the conning tower ladder like monkeys, salvage equipment in hand. One of our lookouts had spotted 2 small rafts. As we approached them, we could see they contained 5 men, obviously delirious and on the verge of death. The men didn't have the strength to catch a line, so we grappled the rafts with hooks and lifted the men on board. They were all stiff as boards from the cold, and we weren't sure all of them were still alive. We brought them down below and placed them between the diesels to warm up. After a while they began to recover. That brought our total number of rescued to 34. During the night, we turned on our searchlight to help spot survivors. This was an extremely dangerous decision, given the large numbers of enemy aircraft and ships operating in the area, but Lange was willing to risk it. Later, we received a radio message reporting more emergency signals scattered throughout 3 different sea squares. A follow-up message reported that a neutral Irish steamer was conducting rescue operations in those areas. We spotted the Irish merchantman at around 2000. She seemed to be doing a conscientious job of searching, so we slipped away, eager not to be noticed. We continued running to and fro, using the periscopes to look for any sign of survivors. After a few more hours of fruitless searching, our skipper decided to head back to port with the ones we had found. Lange reported to headquarters by FT, took one last look around, then pointed our nose back toward the French coast.
Military force in their midst. Adenauer, mindful of the dangers of confrontation with veterans, ordered that no repressive action be taken and that Gehlen should confine himself to monitoring and supervising the secret organization. Gehlen interpreted this as requiring him to covertly support Schnee and his activities while undermining Skorzeny's standing. The mature Skorzeny plan, which Major Robert Beek presented to the CIA in December 1951, had Schnee's fingerprints all over it. Skorzeny's proposals, in his own somewhat cryptic words, were 1. The formation of a basic German cadre in Spain made up of army, air and naval personnel, which could at the same time be used as an organization to absorb the mass of active German forces, the withdrawal of which would have to be organized simultaneously. This latter group would be formed of soldiers, scientists and technicians of the highest quality. 2. The formation of European cadres, which would involve the thorough investigation of all European youth prepared to make the sacrifice. This model European organization could be used later in case of war to go into action throughout European territory. 2a. Later on, with the inclusion of Spanish commando units, I would propose the creation of special sharpshooter cadres within the Spanish army. 3. I should also like to propose, emphasizing that Proposal 1 requires previous American authorization and subsequent aid, that an organization be created for an orderly withdrawal from Germany. The seeds of such a group already exist. It would have to be brought into play only in the case of a catastrophe. Included in this group would be these active elements not already incorporated in other military organisms. Proposal 1 represented Legión Carlos V, the cadre that Skorzeny had sold to an enthusiastic Spanish military elite the previous year. Proposal 2 introduced Skorzeny's pet theme, a pan-European commando force, which he had been working up in the intervening period. It would include a sniper unit of the type Skorzeny had developed with some success at Schwedt. Indeed, its commander and trainer was to be ex-Brandenburger Otto Wilscher. The main core of the commando force would be dedicated to sabotage and special operations, and Skorzeny went into considerable details about their objectives, for which volunteers must be recruited from all the nations of Europe, knowledgeable of their local terrain. The nations he listed were essentially those of the Third Reich, from which Skorzeny had drawn his Jagdverbände units. He had in mind committed anti-communists, in other words, former Nazis. Skorzeny had spent much of summer 1951 cultivating the representatives of various shadowy paramilitary organizations, a number of them from behind the Iron Curtain, in a frenetic 7-week, 16,000-kilometer car trip taking him the length and breadth of Germany. It had been a barnstorming performance that also allowed him to patch up his relationship with the former generals, the weak sister Speidel notwithstanding, and boost his business contacts, including those with Messerschmitt and Otto Wolff. He also lobbied on behalf of Joachim Peiper, making clemency for Peiper the price of his cooperation with the Americans. It is little wonder, therefore, that both the Allied High Commission and the Bonn government came to regard Otto Skorzeny as a man more interested in reversing the verdict of the last war than in fighting for the Allied cause in the next one. Skorzeny blithely believed he held a trump card that would ease his way towards top-level contacts in Washington, a vital prerequisite for his plan's implementation. In September 1951, shortly after his return from Germany, he told Beek that he had evidence of a Soviet spy ring that had successfully planted moles within the Bonn government and the Allied High Commission, sufficiently highly placed to be able to report back to Moscow all important decisions made by the High Commission within 48 hours. If true, this was serious. Beek promised to get high-level specialists onto the matter as soon as possible. It soon transpired that the intelligence was not what it was cracked up to be. Gehlen, who was made party to it, was sceptical, not only on account of its unreliable source, but because the reports handed to his agency were carbon copies, suggesting that Skorzeny was simultaneously peddling the material to a number of interested parties to maximize its value. Not only the CIA in Madrid, but the West German Security Agency, the Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz, BFW, or West German Security Agency, had also received the reports. Nevertheless, the material seemed sufficiently detailed and authentic to exclude outright fabrication. Closer investigation over the coming month uncovered a paper mill compromising former SS officers working in and around Hamburg, in the British zone, who had managed to suborn a few minor officials in the Bonn government. The information they were peddling was at best no better than the surmises that a reasonably competent journalist could get and make. concluded the CIA. In a security operation involving MI6, the CIA, the CIC, the Gehlen-Org and the BFV, the culprits were rounded up. Skorzeny escaped scot-free on the grounds that he was incapable of being an intelligence agent and must therefore have been duped into acting as salesman for the paper mill. He had got off lightly, but the affair was an egregious error of judgment that had damaged any credibility he had with the American intelligence community. From the point of view of the Skorzeny plan, this was extremely unfortunate. At this point, a new and improbable conspirator arrived on the scene, giving Skorzeny fresh hope. Father Konrad Simonsen Mackey, sometimes known as Conrado de Hamburgo, had personal access to the very highest echelons of the Vatican, including future Pope Cardinal Montini and the Francoist regime, indeed General Franco himself. Simonsen had been chaplain to the Condor Legion in the Spanish Civil War and since 1949 had been involved in facilitating Vatican ratlines for Nazis escaping Europe. In 1951, Simonsen was tasked with organizing the Madrid chapter of the Verband Deutsche Soldaten Veterans Group, whose founder members included Guderian and Skorzeny. Realizing that they were never going to gain American support for what was increasingly looking like a neo-Nazi army, Skorzeny and Simonsen began frantically repositioning the Legion Carlos V as simply a patriotic Christian and Catholic force preparing to roll back communist evil. They were to act in partnership, Simonsen taking charge of the spiritual and ideological welfare of the unit, while Skorzeny, good Catholic boy that he was, dealt with technical and military matters. The idea gained traction in ultra-Catholic Spain, and discussions were held with General Muñoz Grandes, who had commanded the Spanish Volunteer Blue Division on the Eastern Front, on the detail of a Hispano-German brigade. By autumn 1952, it had become obvious that Skorzeny and Simonsen were flogging a dead horse. The Skorzeny plan ultimately depended on American assent, money and arms, which were not forthcoming. A form of the plan, worked on by Schnez and tacitly backed by Gehlen, was considered by EUCOM, at that time headed by Eisenhower, and rejected. At about the same time, the Skorzeny version acquired by Beek was reviewed by the CIA's Office of Special Operations. Its verdict was also negative. Skorzeny later blamed the plan's failure on Speidel's slippery double-dealing. Speidel certainly hadn't helped matters by blowing hot and cold, but neither did Skorzeny by picking a quarrel with him, which polarized opinion among former servicemen. Speidel, aware of the damage to the rearmament cause, made attempts to patch up the quarrel, but a breathtakingly arrogant Skorzeny was having none of it. Above all, the Skorzeny plan failed because its time had passed. By 1952, the geopolitical balance had altered. The international situation had stabilized. The Korean War was in stalemate and nuclear confrontation seemed off the table. Adenauer and the Americans had apparently got what they wanted, agreement in principle to a rearmed Germany, which would be carefully integrated within a European-wide defense force, thereby cauterizing any resurgent militarism. Into this new détente, Stalin dropped a bombshell, the so-called Stalin Note of March 1952. It promised German reunification with almost no strings attached. The one precondition was that the German army should be neutral and enter into no alliance or coalition with its former enemies. The proposal was promptly dismissed by the Western powers as a gigantic bluff. But as a diplomatic maneuver, it was indisputably astute. The West offered no possibility of reunification, and the best it could put on the table was a sanitized West German army firmly under US control. The Stalin Note gained traction across German society, not least among Skorzeny's friends on the far right, like Rudel and Otto Ernst Rehmer, now heading the Sozialistische Reichspartei Deutschlands, SRP, who saw it as an opportunity for levering their way back into power. They were forestalled when Adenauer, with the Stalin Note as a bludgeon, was able to cajole the US into an agreement whereby, in return for voluntarily adding 40 German divisions to a European defense force, he greatly enhanced West Germany's sovereignty. The Bonn government stole the far right's clothes, passing a law that would allow former members of the Waffen-SS to join the new West German army, provided they were free of war crimes and below the rank of Oberst. This fulfilled one of the prime demands of HIAG. In the end, almost all the principal actors in the Skorzeny plan got more out of it than the man himself. Speidel went on to play a key role in building the Bundeswehr and later commanded it. Heusinger became its inspector general. Gehlen, meanwhile, was appointed head of the Federal Republic's first completely independent intelligence service, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, BND, in 1956. This marked final victory for the plotters of July 1944. Even Schnees came out smelling of roses, reactivated as a Generalmajor in the Bundeswehr. Willy Messerschmitt initially settled in Spain, but by the end of the decade he was back in business constructing warplanes for the Germans, this time Fiat G91s and Lockheed F-104 starfighters under license. Meantime, Franco and his generals profited from the new tide flowing through international affairs. The Pact of Madrid, a Spanish-American agreement signed in 1953, stopped short of the full bilateral military alliance the Franco regime sought with Washington, but not by much. Spain ended its precarious isolation and received billions of dollars of American military and economic aid in return for the right to construct and run military bases. The pact was symbolic in more ways than one, marking the moment when a somewhat sentimentalized historical admiration for German military culture, with its emphasis upon superior training, meticulous planning, and tactical know-how, was finally displaced by the reality of American global power and its inexhaustible capacity for technological innovation. The Skorzeny plan had failed, but its chief architect was unbowed. He now turns to alternative political means for bringing about his vision of a regeneration.
That was Air Force Blue, the RAF in World War II, Spearhead of Victory, by Patrick Bishop. Read by Tim Francis. This program was produced by ID Audio. A HarperCollins audiobook. Text copyright Patrick Bishop, 2017. Production copyright 2017 by HarperCollins Publishers, all rights reserved. Patrick Bishop asserts the moral right to be identified as the author of this work.
Irish merchantmen had probably picked up their comrades, but nothing could console them. These jumbles of mixed feelings, of joy and sadness, guilt and relief, were quite common in those days as more and more of our comrades were lost to enemy action. Only God in heaven knows why some of us survived, while so many other good men went to their deaths. Who are we to question his wisdom? Just before dawn, we tried to surface and recharge the batteries. An aircraft alarm quickly put a premature end to that endeavor. We didn't dare try again until after sunset. Because of the large number of extra personnel on board, the carbon dioxide level inside the boat reached dangerous levels by the time we were finally able to surface. Dumping overboard the buckets of human waste was also long overdue. That first gust of clean air that spilled into the boat with the opening of the top hatch smelled sweeter than roses to us. As usual, Lange was up on the bridge in the blink of an eye, chain-smoking one Jan Maat cigarette after another. That evening we received an FT from the Chief of U-Boat Western Command. We were ordered to bring our passengers to a position code-named Ice Bear, Polar Bear. We knew this meant we were being directed to the U-boat base in Brest Harbor, rather than our home port of Lorient. We were excited about the prospect of having a few days' liberty in a new city. We knew that with the 1st and 9th U-boat flotillas stationed at Brest, we could find everything we wanted. New Year's Eve this year was not an especially festive one for us. We had to put extra toilet pails between the diesels because so many of the crewmen from T-25 were suffering from acute diarrhea. There were usually 2 or 3 of them standing around each pail, urging the poor soul on the throne to hurry up. Many of them were also developing agonizing catarrhs, inflammations, and cysts. There was nothing we could do for them, since our store of medicines was never intended to serve so many men suffering from such prolonged and severe exposure to the cold. Although we never complained to them about it, our guests were making even the most routine of operations on the boat very difficult. We knew it would be absolutely impossible to conduct a quick crash dive in the usual manner with so many men crowded about. Since we would have been sitting ducks on the surface for any attacking aircraft, Lange made the decision to run submerged as much as possible. Typically, after 8 or 9 hours in the basement, we would rise to periscope depth, take a quick look around, then pop up to the surface. While the men on watch clambered up the ladder to the bridge, the diesel crew would fire up the big jumbos. That's when we would feel the delicious, ice-cold sea breeze being sucked into the boat, replacing the stale, fetid stenches that had accumulated during the previous hours. The inrush of oxygen had an immediate regenerating effect on our bodies and minds. Broad smiles always creased across the faces of our guests as soon as they smelled the fresh sea air. We were busy as bees during those brief periods on the surface, emptying the buckets, pumping out the bilges, shooting a fix with the sextant, etc. And, of course, there was the old man, the inevitable cigarette dangling from his lips, silently overseeing it all like a gargoyle perched on the bridge. That evening we finally had to confront what we feared the most, an emergency crash dive to avoid an enemy aircraft. There was nothing else to do but elbow our guests out of the way as we grabbed for the various valves and levers needed to submerge. They didn't mind the violent shoving as much as the steep angle of the boat as we dove. They weren't used to such excitement, and their heavy breathing used up our oxygen much faster than usual. Luckily, the plane didn't attack us and everything turned out okay. We spent the last few hours of 1943 serenely cruising 60 meters beneath the surface, trading war stories and tall tales with our guests. They couldn't understand why we enjoyed serving on a vessel that sank several times a day. We couldn't understand why they enjoyed serving on a boat that couldn't dive to escape the enemy. The teasing was all good-natured, and a close bond developed between our two crews. We laughed and spun yarns until, before we knew it, it was midnight. Lange's deep, resonant voice crackled over the intercom, wishing us a Happy New Year. His wish that we all survived to celebrate another New Year in 1945 was met with somber assent. We surfaced on the first morning of 1944 to find mirror-smooth seas stretching before us. Our course was east, toward the big orange rising sun. The diesels were pounding away at high speed, causing our prow to cut a high, clean bow wave. The view from the bridge was gorgeous. All of the T-25 crewmen, even the ones who had suffered the worst hypothermia, were up and about. With the fine weather and the full recovery of our guests, spirits were especially high. They had told us where to go in Brest for the best drinks and the prettiest girls, so our minds were filled with anticipation for the charms awaiting us. Everyone was eager to relax and have some fun before getting back in the war. We reluctantly dove back down to 60 meters to avoid any unpleasant surprises during this last leg of our mission. Around noon, we surfaced for a few minutes in order to get a fix on our position with the sextant. Navigator Reinig calculated we were 30 nautical miles off course. The old man, always eager to exercise his seamanship skills, double-checked Reinig's computations. Sure enough, we had drifted significantly off course. As we soon learned, our direction finder device had malfunctioned. Equipment failures on our boat were becoming so common that they barely raised an eyebrow anymore. Luckily, we were only 12 hours away from Brest, so no serious problems were anticipated with finding our way to port. We radioed Brest, informing them of our position and the equipment failure. They radioed back detailed navigation instructions. We would be using a complex system of beacon fires and searchlights to visually find our way to the harbor. First U-boat flotilla would be doing everything they could to ensure our safe return. We sped away from the area submerged in case the enemy had triangulated our position by monitoring our broadcast. In the small hours of the morning we surfaced in C-square BF 5464 to begin our final sprint to base. We all crossed our fingers in the hope we could reach our rendezvous point with the escorts while still under cover of darkness. The diesels, running at maximum speed, left a giant wedge of white foam in our wake. The sea was still calm as a duck pond. We met our escort a little after dawn. We followed them along the rocky coast towards the entrance of the harbor, all the while keeping an intense lookout for any airborne intruders. When we arrived in Brest's outer harbor, our sub was met by a barge filled to overflowing with war correspondents. Included among them was a film crew who wanted to take motion pictures of the T-25 survivors crowded in our boat's interior. The big barge heaved to, and the film crew came aboard, carrying with them a large array of photographic equipment. They were getting some fine footage of the sardine can conditions inside our boat when suddenly a blinding, lightning-like flash erupted from the electric motor room. A huge blue-white bolt of electricity was arcing out from the starboard motor. A great cloud of white smoke, then evil-smelling black smoke, billowed from the motor. Moments later, flames began licking up from the motor housing. This dramatic electrical display caused an immediate panic among the war correspondents, who stampeded like a herd of frightened cattle toward the control room. The T-25 survivors joined them when the choking cloud of smoke began to make its way through the boat. We crewmen knew immediately what had happened because it had happened before. It was another short in our electrical control panel. The boys in the motor room used the CO fire extinguishers to good effect, and within a few minutes the fire was out. The diesel chief switched the jumbos to internal air intake. Before long, the big 9-cylinder engines had inhaled all of the smoke. It took a while before our stoic attitudes had any effect on our guests, though. The lingering odor of burned rubber and our guests' nervousness persisted for some time. Privately, we just had to shake our heads. It just wouldn't have been U-505 if something like this had not happened. The whole hair-raising episode would have been funny, except we knew the burned-out control panel would probably keep us stranded in Brest for a couple of extra weeks for repairs. A little later, a couple of small steam-engine tugs met us and guided our boat through the harbor toward the submarine bunker complex. Around noon, we finally entered Brest's inner harbor. Our escort vessels veered off to their moorings while we continued on to the big U-boat pens. The massive concrete bunkers were just as large and imposing as the ones back in Lorient. Sailors crowded every inch of U-505's upper deck as we inched up to the pier in front of bunker C1. We were happy to see a large reception waiting for us at the pier. The commanders of both the 1st U-boat flotilla and Brest's torpedo boat flotilla were there. An unusually large collection of sailors, soldiers, and staff officers were also in attendance. For the first time in a long time, there was a Navy band to add a bit of old-fashioned pomp to these festivities. It seemed like an eternity since we had enjoyed a reception like this. As we made our final approach to the slip for bunker C1, a cluster of crewmen from T-25, a little too eager to disembark, simultaneously rushed to climb the ladder from the control room to the bridge. In his excitement, one of the sailors slipped off and landed on the helmsman's rudder control. Our boat immediately swerved starboard, crushing the diving plane fin against the pier. The only thing we felt inside the boat was a momentary shudder and shake, but instinctively we knew the damage was serious. 1,200 tons of mass, even when moving slowly, would do terrible damage to a fragile piece like a diving fin. Later that afternoon, U-505 was lifted up on rails into dry dock for close inspection. There it was discovered that our boat's diving plane shaft had been bent, necessitating at least 2 weeks for repair. It took 2 full days of back-breaking labor just to extract the shaft from its housing. Once out, a committee of shipyard engineers decided the shaft was beyond repair and had to be replaced. Unfortunately, there were no spare shafts to be found, either in Brest or Lorient. Until another one could be found, U-505 was stuck in port. Lange swore like a Turk when he heard the news. A few days later, word came through to our skipper that a spare shaft had been located in Bordeaux, the southernmost of our U-boat sally ports on the Atlantic. Within a few minutes of hearing that news, I was ordered to report to the old man's quarters. "Gibbler, I understand you have a driver's license. Have you ever driven a truck?" "Jawohl, Herr Oberleutnant." "Good. Sign out a pistol from the arsenal this afternoon. Tomorrow morning you will report to the carpool, drive to Bordeaux, and organize a shaft for our diving plane." Apparently my reputation for organizing supplies had reached our skipper's ears. I was quite annoyed that my leisure time in Brest would be interrupted by this mission, but orders were orders, so I hurried to the arsenal. As I presented Lange's authorization for a pistol to the arms-room duty officer, I found that I was strangely excited by the prospect of carrying a sidearm on this special mission. Would it be a handsome Luger? Perhaps one of the sleek Walter pistols? Imagine my shock when the duty officer handed me an enormous, ancient-looking French revolver. The ridiculous antique was well over 1 foot long and heavy as a small cannon. When I stuck it into my belt, the barrel literally reached down to my knee. The duty officer refused to listen to my pleadings for a replacement weapon and brusquely sent me on my way. I knew I was going to get teased by my crewmates when I arrived back at the barracks. They didn't disappoint me. "Hey, look, there's Buffalo Bill. Yeah, he's going to kill 2 buffaloes with 1 shot from that big gun." I got angry at all the laughter and, in disgust, tossed the pistol onto my bunk. Unfortunately, my buddy Willie, who was already quite intoxicated at this hour of the day, picked it up and began waving it around, pretending to be an American cowboy. I was responsible for the weapon, so I tried to wrestle it away from him. Well, the inevitable happened. Willie's finger was on the trigger, and before we knew it, the old pistol let loose with a tremendous bang. No one was hurt, but the bullet went clean through the wall into the bathroom next door, taking a big chip out of a toilet bowl. We knew we had to act quickly if we were to stay out of the brig. There was an artillery mechanic who was bunking in the same room with us, who, through an incredible bit of luck, had a spare bullet that more or less fit the old revolver's cylinder. We replaced the fired cartridge with a new one, while others concealed the hole in the wall with a pillow. Someone else blew through the gun barrel to clear the smoke, and then gave the pistol a quick wipe with a rag. Just then the Raccoon, our engineering officer, burst into the room and demanded an explanation for the gunshot noise. He was clearly not convinced by our protestations of innocence, nor even by the pistol's apparently unfired condition. "If you didn't do it, then who fired the shot?" he demanded. "There he is!" shouted one of my mates, pointing out the window toward a sailor running across the barracks square. The engineering officer gave a quick glance at the obviously innocent sailor rushing across the square, and then turned back to us, annoyance and frustration painted all over his face. He stood there glowering at us for what seemed like an eternity. Finally, he just shook his head and left the room without another word. Willie, sobered by our close brush with a court-martial, spent the rest of the evening organizing materials to repair the wall and toilet. Determined not to get into any further trouble, I was up before dawn and standing in the motor pool by 0600, waiting for them to open. Strapped to my side was the flak gun, my nickname for the old revolver. I was assigned 2 drivers for the trip. Together we loaded several spare gas cans into the back of the truck. Before we left, we received some quick instructions on what to do in case we encountered any partisans. There had been several recent ambushes and acts of sabotage by the resistance along our route, and we were sternly warned not to travel at night. My 2 companions were also armed, though with more respectable weapons than my embarrassing antique. Within an hour we were roaring down the road towards Bordeaux. During daylight hours we drove in shifts, trading places every 150 kilometers. We stopped and spent the night in a small naval anti-aircraft base, but were back on the road by sunrise. Later that morning we were passing through a small forest near La Rochelle when some men in civilian clothes suddenly appeared and opened fire on us with rifles. They were obviously in desperate need of some target practice, because none of their shots even touched the truck. Nevertheless, we pushed that truck's gas pedal to the floor to get past them as quickly as we could. I must admit, though, we were also trying to get to Bordeaux as early as possible so that we could have some free time out on the town. We immediately checked into the U-boat base upon our arrival in Bordeaux. The diameter of the diving plane shaft, the authorities told us, was a few hundredths of an inch too thick and would need to be machined down on a giant lathe. "We're sorry," they said, "but you'll have to wait here in Bordeaux for 2 or 3 days until the job is completed." That's all we needed to hear. We were out the gate and on our way to the entertainment district before they had a chance to change their minds. Once in town, I decided to have a bite to eat in a little tavern. My naval uniform attracted quite a bit of attention from the other customers. I thought they were just admiring my U-boat badge as usual. Little did I know the attention being showered upon me was because the establishment was off limits to German personnel. Well, I was just sitting there, innocently enjoying a little seafood, when a very attractive woman sat down at my table and struck up a conversation. She insisted on buying me several drinks, and since she was covered in expensive pieces of jewelry, I let her pay without protest. After a few hours of drinking, she invited me to visit her at her house later in the evening. I was happy to accept, especially after she offered to have dinner ready for me, too. I showed up at the address she had given me at the appointed hour. When she answered the door, she placed a finger to her lips, signaling me to be quiet as I entered the house. As we crept through the parlor, I could see an enormously obese old man sleeping in a chair, his rolls of fat literally dripping over the arms of the chair. I assumed he was the woman's father. She led me to a bedroom on the 3rd floor. Inside there was a tray covered with bottles of champagne and various delicacies to eat. She told me to make myself comfortable and to start on the food and drink without her. She would be up to join me in an hour or so. I didn't need much encouragement to open a bottle and start to sample the expensive hors d'oeuvres. There was cheese, biscuits, jam, canned sardines, olives, roasted meat, and dried fruit. It was magnificent. After an hour or so of eating and drinking, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a peek outside the room. To my shock, I found that the door had been locked. Panic gripped my heart. Was this a trap set for me by the French resistance? I pulled the old pistol out and rechecked the cylinder to make sure it was loaded. Just then I heard a key being inserted into the door lock. I lowered the barrel of the pistol toward the door. Instead of a band of armed guerrillas, however, there was the woman, dressed in fancy red lingerie. The situation still smelled like trouble to me, but the sight of the lady's ample charms soon made me forget all my qualms about the situation. "Now," she said smilingly, "you've eaten my food and drunk my wine. It's time to repay your debt to me." Well, that was the kind of debt any sailor would be happy to repay. A little while later she explained that the fat old man in the parlor was her husband. I didn't have to worry, she said. I was perfectly safe up here on the 3rd floor because he couldn't climb the stairs. I told her I would be happy to continue our arrangement, but that I could only stay for 72 hours. She was more than agreeable, and she spent the next 2 days and nights serving me rich food and champagne, then making me repay the debt in the fancy canopy bed. Sometimes I heard the giggling of young girls outside the door during our love sessions. I guessed that everyone in the house knew what was going on, except for the foolish old man in the chair. By the time I left that house, I felt like an orange. Chapter 13. Brest. In the early morning hours of December 30th, we heard 2 loud aircraft bombs explode at a moderate distance from our boat. The hollow booms reverberating through the boat frightened our guests from the T-25, but they calmed down when they saw our practiced nonchalance. In general, they were grateful beyond measure for their rescue, but their relief was tempered by a gnawing concern about the fate of their missing crewmates. We tried to assure them the Irish merchantmen had probably picked up their comrades, but nothing could console them. These jumbles of mixed feelings, of joy and sadness, guilt and relief, were quite common in those days as more and more of our comrades were lost to enemy action. Only God in heaven knows why some of us survived, while so many other good men went to their deaths. Who are we to question his wisdom? Just before dawn, we tried to surface and recharge the batteries. An aircraft alarm quickly put a premature end to that endeavor. We didn't dare try again until after sunset. Because of the large number of extra personnel on board, the carbon dioxide level inside the boat reached dangerous levels by the time we were finally able to surface. Dumping overboard the buckets of human waste was also long overdue. That first gust of clean air that spilled into the boat with the opening of the top hatch smelled sweeter than roses to us. As usual, Lange was up on the bridge in the blink of an eye, chain-smoking one Jan Mat cigarette after another. That evening we received an FT from the Chief of U-Boat Western Command. We were ordered to bring our passengers to a position code-named Ice Bear, Polar Bear. We knew this meant we were being directed to the U-boat base in Brest Harbor, rather than our home port of Lorient. We were excited about the prospect of having a few days' liberty in a new city. We knew that with the 1st and 9th U-boat flotillas stationed at Brest, we could find everything we wanted. New Year's Eve this year was not an especially festive one for us. We had to put extra toilet pails between the diesels because so many of the crewmen from T-25 were suffering from acute diarrhea. There were usually 2 or 3 of them standing around each pail, urging the poor soul on the throne to hurry up. Many of them were also developing agonizing catarrhs, inflammations, and cysts. There was nothing we could do for them, since our store of medicines was never intended to serve so many men suffering from such prolonged and severe exposure to the cold. Although we never complained to them about it, our guests were making even the most routine of operations on the boat very difficult. We knew it would be absolutely impossible to conduct a quick crash dive in the usual manner with so many men crowded about. Since we would have been sitting ducks on the surface for any attacking aircraft, Lange made the decision to run Chapter 14, The Last Patrol. By the Ides of March, our boat was again ready for departure. At precisely 18:35 hours on March 16, 1944, the lines were cast off, and we unceremoniously backed out of bunker C1. Once clear of the pier, our diesels revved up, and we rumbled toward the harbor mouth. I remember how proud I felt watching our skipper's handsome blue commander's pennant snapping in the breeze. Little did we suspect this would be our last patrol of the war. Our mood as we headed toward deep water was a bit more somber than usual. Back in port, we had heard rumors that during our 10-week stay in Brest, approximately 4 dozen of our sister U-boats had been sunk. We calculated amongst ourselves and determined that there was now only about a 30% chance that a boat would return safely from a war patrol. The statistical probability of us surviving to the war's end was becoming very small indeed. No one had any illusions whatsoever about what we were heading into. At the beginning of the war, our thoughts dwelled on the few comrades who had been lost. Now we were struck by how few of our old friends were still alive. Despite the odds against us, we were absolutely determined to do our duty. With full confidence in our skipper and in ourselves, our attitude was simultaneously hopeful and fatalistic. The slogan that predominated on our boat was, "Let's get going and see what kind of success we can achieve on the open sea. What will be, will be." Personally, I had no qualms about our chances. Perhaps I was merely fooling myself, but at the time I had absolutely no doubt that we would return safely from this patrol. Not only that, I still had total faith that Germany would win the war. I was far from alone in this belief. We placed most of our hopes on the new generation of weapons our scientists were developing, like rockets, jets, and guided missiles. Of course, my comrades and I spent many hours trading scuttlebutt about the new U-boats, too. It was said they could travel underwater indefinitely and could sail circles around the fastest destroyers. I dreamed of the day when our new boats would sweep the ocean clean of the hated enemy and bring a victorious end to the war. Our passage through the Bay of Biscay began very well. The weather was excellent, and our test dive passed without incident. To be free of the curse of sabotage felt very good indeed. Inside U-505, we quickly reaccustomed ourselves to the roar of the diesels, the earthy smell of fresh potatoes, and the complex rituals required for surfacing and diving. All passed as smoothly as clockwork. Only the faint rumbling of bomb detonations in the distance reminded us we were not on a peacetime training cruise. Lange's approach to command was an interesting one. In general, he was fairly cautious, but when the situation demanded, he was more than willing to take a chance based on his intuition. For instance, we had a new, longer-ranged version of the Naxos radar detection device on board. But based on our near-fatal experience off Trinidad, the old man refused to allow any newfangled electrical device to relax the alertness of our bridge watch. On the other hand, as we passed through the most dangerous part of the Bay of Biscay, the skipper decided to gamble with a sprint on the surface with the Diesels. "Better to clear the area as quickly as possible," he said, "than to crawl slowly under water and be stuck in the suicide stretch forever." Unfortunately, unlike most of the new boats now coming out of the shipyards, U-505 was not equipped with the new snorkel device that would have allowed us to run the Diesels under water. We had to take our chances on the surface. Lange's intuition was correct, however, and we sailed through the most dangerous part of the bay without any attacks from the buzzards. When Lange opened his sealed sailing orders, he learned that we would be returning to the old hunting grounds we had prowled in our first war patrol, the West African coast. This news, when it reached our ears, greatly pleased us. We were tired of cold weather and imagined ourselves returning to Lorient with a suntan and plenty of victory pennants flying from our bridge. We were sure our new skipper had erased Czech's Curse of the Flowers, and that we were now sailing under a lucky star. Quite a crowd developed around the chart table when the map of the African coast was spread out. However, an annoyance immediately arose that complicated our lives. The new T5 Zaunkönig Wren acoustic homing torpedoes we had taken on board in Brest. These complex, electrically propelled eels were nicknamed destroyer killers, because it was hoped we could fire them in the general direction of the enemy escorts and they would automatically chase down our tormentors. Unfortunately, they contained delicate instrumentation that required constant attention and maintenance from the torpedo mechanics. Every 24 hours they had to be withdrawn from the tubes, dried, and adjusted. Lamentably, since the fore and aft torpedo rooms doubled as our crew's sleeping quarters, the mechanics had to fold up our bunks out of the way in order to perform their daily maintenance on the torpedoes. We quickly learned to sleep sitting or even standing upright. Even so, the days and nights began to merge into a sleep-deprived blur. On the brighter side, the Raccoon, our much-despised engineering officer, no longer disciplined us so strictly. Unlike Czech, Lange did not want his men's leave time arbitrarily deducted for petty infractions. As a result, the Raccoon was robbed of his favorite pastime, and our lives became much easier. After a while, he even stopped obsessively trimming his beard. Heavens, how thankful we were to have Harald Lange as our skipper. There were several youngsters who had transferred into our crew at Brest, and they didn't realize how easy they had it now that the old man was running U-505. I'm sure many thought we were inventing some of the stories about life under Czech. Still, they did experience some tough moments when the weather got rough. The water was smooth as a mirror when we left port, but after a week or so the sea started to whip up, and those poor fellows had to go through violent bouts of seasickness just as we all had, until they gained their sea legs. We would just shake our heads and laugh in good-hearted sympathy when the new guys turned green. Occasionally we gave them helpful advice like, "If you vomit so hard that you throw up your asshole, you'd better swallow quick." All new sailors had to go through this rite of passage, and they were not fully accepted as true members of the crew until they had done so. During the last week in March, as we approached tropical waters, the weather worsened dramatically. Tremendous waves and gale-force winds blowing from the west battered our boat with stunning force. The whole sub shook and shuddered when the breakers crashed against our conning tower. The poor guys on bridge watch really suffered, They would climb down the ladder into the control room looking like drowned cats, cursing the weather with the kind of hair-raising oaths that only sailors at sea can concoct. Naturally, we crewmen on duty in the relative comfort of the control room saw fit to make humorous comments on their soaked condition. In retaliation, they would be intentionally slow to close the bridge hatch, drenching us all with cascades of seawater when the next big wave hit. The real agony started later, when the drying salt water caused us to itch all over. Eventually, the weather got so rough the old man took pity on us, and we cruised submerged for a few days. When we surfaced to recharge batteries, however, the torture began all over again for the poor guys on watch. By the time the weather calmed down, most of us had red, swollen eyes from staring into the driving salty spray. Through it all, though, none of us begrudged Lange's demand that there be no let-up in our vigilance, no matter what the condition of the sea. As for me, I spent most of my free time reading. I was especially fascinated with Jack London's stories about Alaska. For hours at a time I lost myself in daydreams about life in the mountains and virgin forests of North America. The quiet, open spaces and fresh air of Alaska offered the perfect fantasy escape world. That is, until my next stint on watch or in the control room jerked me back to the stinking, claustrophobic reality of submarine warfare. Motivated by a desire to make my Alaskan dreams come true someday, I took great pains to keep up my self-taught English lessons. One very regrettable day I was practicing to say the word queen because the Q consonant sound was particularly difficult for me to pronounce. A couple of my buddies overheard me repeating the word and immediately began calling me by that name. Even Lange called me Queen a couple of times. I hated that nickname so much I almost stopped practicing my lessons. In the end, though, I continued with my lessons, and eventually my crewmates tired of the joke. Needless to say, I took care to choose a different Q word to practice my pronunciation in the future. The bad weather kept us busy more or less constantly, but once the weather calmed, we had more leisure time. To relax, I especially liked standing on the bridge at night, enjoying a quiet smoke and watching the star constellations sway back and forth in time with the rocking of the boat. Without a horizon to provide a reference point, it seemed like God was rocking us in a heavenly cradle, infinite in its size and beauty. Of course, such moments of carefree whimsy were a rare luxury aboard a U-boat in 1944. It was sobering to remember that my few minutes of leisure were only possible because 4 other sets of eyes were there on the bridge, busy at work scanning the horizon for danger. Who knows how many young sailors, lost in the beauty of the nighttime ocean sky, let their minds wander away from their duty and as a result never returned home to their family. At any rate, the skipper was very good about letting us have a breath of fresh air whenever possible. He understood how important a few minutes topside can be for a submariner's health and morale. In comparing Lange to Czech, it was clear to us that the old man's experience as an ordinary seaman was more valuable in making for a good skipper than all of Czech's years in the Naval Academy. During those days, I sometimes volunteered to help my buddy Tony finish washing the dishes early so he could enjoy a few minutes topside too. He would inevitably fall asleep in the warm tropical breeze, exhausted from cooking for a crew far larger than our small galley was designed for. In appreciation for his breaks from the galley, Tony would often save me an extra scoop of dessert. The monotony of submarine food made an occasional cup of pudding with raspberry syrup poured on top, my favorite, seemed like the most luxurious dish in the world. At night, Tony would often bring the bridge watch a hot pot of sweet coffee mixed with a little rum. Only someone who has lived and fought aboard one of those old submarines can truly understand the comfort and joy such simple demonstrations of comradeship could provide. Remembering the sense of brotherhood we felt for each other in our crowded little steel cave makes me angry to hear thoughtless people refer to us today as Nazi submariners. Who were the Nazis aboard our submarine? I never met one. When we were on duty, we followed the course set by our skipper. When we were off duty, we tried to enjoy ourselves, read letters from our loved ones, and dreamed of the day peace would return to our homeland. In this way, we were identical to the sailors from every nation who faced the hazards of war and the sea during those years. Party members or not, we performed our duties with professionalism and honor. American Admiral Chester Nimitz knew this when he put his career on the line to defend the Kriegsmarine's wartime conduct during the Nuremberg trials. Of course, many lies have been told about the men of Germany's armed forces during World War II. Some of these storytellers are Germans themselves, who surely know better, but who, for their own motives, perpetuate these lies. They create the impression that there were a few bad Germans, inhuman Nazi monsters who wanted to conquer the world, and the good Germans, gentle little lambs who were against the Nazis and wanted peace, but were forced to fight against their will. Naturally, they always happened to be members of the second group. All of this is pure self-serving fantasy. Whether one was a party member or not didn't matter a bit. Everyone I knew, without exception, was willing and eager to fight. The reasons were quite simple. First and foremost, our country was literally in a life-or-death struggle with Soviet communism. Depending upon our success on the battlefield, our nation was to be or not to be. Like Admiral Dönitz told us many times, we were fighting to save our country, not for a particular leader or political party. Second, almost everyone had family members who had been killed in the bombings or on the battlefield. We wanted to avenge ourselves against the gangsters who had brought about their deaths. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, a depth charge exploding over your head did not care about your politics or religion. So doing your duty to the best of one's ability was the best means of self-preservation. These were the reasons we fought on, united as a crew and as a nation against impossible odds. It never entered our minds for a moment whether this one was a Nazi or that one was not. We considered ourselves patriots, pure and simple. Ideology at that point in the war was irrelevant. On April 1st, we remembered the anniversary of our first crossing of the equator under our old skipper, Axel Löwe. It was hard to believe that it had been 2 years since we celebrated the exotic rituals of Neptune. So much had happened since then. It seemed as if an eternity had passed. How easy and simple those earlier days seemed, when targets were plentiful and attacks from enemy planes were the exception rather than the rule. Lange was a skillful U-boat veteran, and he had high hopes for this patrol. As we entered the warm waters off Africa, the waves took on a different character. Gone were the tall, violent breakers of March. Instead, we experienced enormously long swells that alternately pushed our boat forward, then pulled her astern. Progress in these seas felt like riding on a child's swing. The greener members of our crew were not used to these new motions and went through another serious bout of seasickness. For the next several days they could be seen with their heads in buckets or leaning over the rails, offering their meals to Neptune. We received an FT from headquarters in the early hours of April 4th. The whole boat buzzed with speculation regarding its content. Lange guessed what all the murmuring was about and broke the news to us. We had been directed to a rendezvous with U-123 at C-square DG 9179. Lange was a wise old fox to let us know what was going on. The tropical heat was beginning to irritate us, and the skipper didn't need any unfounded rumors making the rounds. 3 days later, U-123 came into view. She was the former boat of Reinhard Hartigan, now skippered by his executive officer, Horst von Schrader. The anti-aircraft crews on both our boats were on full alert during the brief meeting. Our exec, Paul Meyer, paddled over to the other boat to pass some secret codes over to them. 1/2 hour later, we waved goodbye and departed. Later that afternoon, we heard 24 depth charges exploding in the distance. We hoped the noise was not signaling the demise of U-123. That was one big difference between U-boats and the surface ships we fought. A ship almost always had time to radio an SOS to rescuers before sinking. On the other hand, U-boats often sank without being able to broadcast their fate to headquarters or any potential rescuers. After several days of anxious waiting, we were usually left to assume the worst, after a boat failed to radio in as scheduled. As it turned out, U-123 wasn't sunk in the depth charge attack we heard. Indeed, like our own boat, she was one of the very few German submarines to survive the war. When the Allies overran France later that year, Admiral Dönitz ordered all operational boats stationed on France's Atlantic coast to sail immediately for German-controlled ports on the Baltic or North Seas. U-123, however, was left stranded in Lorient dry docks, unable to sail because of a lack of batteries for her electric motors. After the war, the French Navy found the boat, repaired her, and rechristened her the Blaisan. She stayed on active service until 1953, when, regrettably, she was scrapped. It is a shame that this valiant and historic boat was destroyed for a few $100s of scrap metal. It was around this part of the war patrol that we had a memorable incident aboard the old U-505. Looking back, the entire affair was rather disgusting, but at the time it passed for high entertainment. It all started when we noticed that Gerd, one of the diesel mates, was spending much of the day holding and gingerly rubbing the front of his pants. Well, this didn't surprise any of us, because this particular fellow was notorious for his lack of discrimination in choosing his bedmates. Every single time we had set sail on patrol, he was found to have contracted some sort of disease from the ladies in port. Because of our critical shortage of manpower, contracting one of these diseases during wartime was considered a serious offense in the German military. For instance, sailors who got gonorrhea were sent to a special hospital near Paris called the Ritterburg. Once the agonizing treatments for the disease were completed, these were the days before the advent of penicillin, the sailors were promptly court-martialed and thrown into prison for 3 or 4 months. Gert had obviously caught one of these diseases while we were in Brest. According to regulations, he should have been immediately transferred to a homebound U-boat and arrested upon his return. Well, no one wanted Gerd to be court-martialed, so with the skipper's permission, we decided to treat him on board U-505 ourselves. After a cursory examination, our quack doctor decided that an immediate operation was required. My friend Otto Dietz acted as a medic and made all the preparations. The mess table in the petty officers' quarters was transformed into an operating platform. After the doctor gave Gert an injection to relax, Otto cut a hole in the blanket for the poor guy's penis to protrude through during the operation. Otto, ever the clown, wanted to make sure the hole was the right size, so he stuck his own joystick through the blanket and began parading it around for the benefit of us crewmen in the front torpedo room quarters. His crazy antics made everyone curious about what was going on, and soon the whole crew was jammed against the hatches to the operating room, straining to get a glance of the procedure. But when the doctor tried to poke Gerd's penis through the blanket, he found that the hole wasn't nearly big enough. Chapter 15. Captured. June 4th, 1944, began like any other day. Indeed, there was nothing that set it apart in my mind at the time, except that it was a Sunday. We were low on oxygen, so everyone not on duty was confined to their bunks to conserve air. I laid there in that stinking bunk, whispering prayers from the little black Bible my mother had given me when I joined the Kriegsmarine. In her dedication to me on the inside cover of the Bible, she had noted the passage from Romans 13, verse 10. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor. Therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. The tender message she held so close to her heart seemed bitterly ironic, given the life-or-death struggle we faced here at sea. By noon, I was back on duty in the control room. The smell of hot coffee wafted through the boat, and I remember wondering, rather absent-mindedly, what was for lunch. It was at this moment our hydrophone soundman reported faint propeller noises coming from several distant points off our stern. The skipper thought a convoy might have blundered across our path. It never occurred to any of us that the damned carrier task force might have accidentally intercepted us. After a quick word with the exec, Lange ordered us up to periscope depth to investigate the noise. We rose toward the surface very slowly, anxious not to cause too much turbulence in the water with our periscope mast. As we neared periscope depth, the order went out for torpedo battle stations. After weeks of frustrating waiting, we were all very excited at the prospect of finally drawing blood. Lange climbed up to the conning tower to take a peek through the scope at our targets. No sooner had the periscope breached the surface than we heard the old man's booming voice shout out, "Destroyer!" In fact, as he scanned back and forth, he counted 3 enemy destroyers, all virtually on top of us and roaring in for the attack. He yelled out that there were also planes overhead and a vessel that was probably a small aircraft carrier in the distance. Our underwater sound equipment was obviously faulty, which allowed the hunter-killer task force we thought we had escaped to creep right up on top of us. Our most dreaded fear had come true. We blindly fired 1 torpedo in the general direction of the carrier, more to create a distraction than in any hope of actually hitting the target. Then the skipper ordered us to dive for the basement. Our only chance of survival was to get down to our maximum depth and hope we could once again ride out another prolonged beating from depth charges. As we began to leave the surface, we heard the unmistakable sound of a destroyer's high-speed propellers approach, louder than we'd ever heard them before. A few seconds later, and at point-blank range, the destroyer fired a full salvo of hedgehogs. the Allies' deadly anti-submarine mortars. Somehow the shotgun patter of hedgehogs missed us as we started a series of violent, evasive maneuvers to throw off our attackers. We were beginning to think we might have a chance to escape when we suddenly heard a loud metallic clinking noise coming from above our heads. Everyone in the compartment looked at each other in puzzlement, trying to guess the meaning of such a sound. We were quite familiar with every underwater noise a wartime submarine was ever likely to encounter, but this one was completely new. The majority opinion thought it sounded like the links of a heavy chain being dragged across our hull. When I heard that suggestion, a cold chill ran through my blood, and I instinctively grabbed for something to hold on to. Surely the noise meant we had snagged the mooring chain of a mine, and that a fatal wall of water would come crashing through the hull any second. After a few seconds, however, the sound ceased. In my blissful ignorance, I thought the danger was over, and I allowed myself to relax a bit. What we didn't realize at the time was that the sound was actually caused by heavy 50-caliber machine gun bullets hitting the hull of our boat as we descended into the depths. The bullets were being fired by a couple of fighter planes launched by the American aircraft carrier lying just a few miles off our stern. Freakishly clear water conditions had allowed the enemy pilots to spot our boat despite our depth. A short time later, while we were still only about 60 meters deep, the depth charges began to explode. The first few charges were close, and the next few even closer. Then 2 ear-shattering detonations sent us flying off our feet. The boat almost keeled over from the force of one of the blasts. We had experienced many close depth charge explosions before, but the impact of those devils was the biggest by far. We found out later that the Americans were using giant 600-pound depth charges on us. All the lights went out, but we didn't need our eyes to tell us we were taking on water in the control room. The leak was small, but the water coming in was at such high pressure that if you accidentally blundered into the stream, it felt like being burned by a hot iron. Perhaps it was just fear, but I began to feel the air pressure squeezing against my chest and ears as I imagined seawater filling the control room bilge. Luckily, the leak was manageable and was probably coming from a sprung valve or pipe, because the pressure hull seemed to be holding up. Nevertheless, I prayed our pumps could catch up with the intake of water. Otherwise, it was only a matter of time before our boat sank like a stone to the ocean floor. When the emergency lighting came on, we tried to operate our equipment, only to discover that all electrical devices were dead. Despite the gravity of the situation, everyone stayed relatively calm, awaiting our skipper's orders. After all, we had survived Silcock's attack, and we were still confident we could handle just about anything. A moment later, however, more bad news came in. Reports from the rear compartments told of severe flooding in the aft torpedo room. Lange ordered the compartment to be evacuated and its watertight hatch clamped shut. No sooner was that done than we heard the worst news of all. The helmsman reported our main rudder was jammed. Our boat was stuck turning in a tight starboard circle, totally out of control. There was an emergency method for steering the boat manually, but the auxiliary rudder control hand wheel could only be operated from the evacuated aft torpedo room. When word got around that we had lost steering control, we knew for sure that our beloved U-505 was doomed. Lange ordered us to surface. The old man didn't have to tell us that, one way or another, the war would be over for us in just a few more minutes. The only question on our mind was when the skipper would order us to abandon ship. But to abandon ship, we first needed to get back to the surface. No one except those of us in the control room knew our sub was still plummeting toward the bottom in an uncontrolled dive. We frantically worked the controls to pull us up, but we discovered the diving planes were jammed in a downward position and that some of the ballast tank valves were not responding. We desperately tried every trick in the book to pump enough air into the tanks before we passed our crash depth. Something must have worked, because our boat's descent finally stopped, and we began to rise to the surface. I am unsure how deep we had sunk. Everyone assumed we would get the abandoned ship order as soon as we got to the surface, but there was always the chance our skipper would order battle station surface instead. Of course, we had heard several stories about damaged U-boats that had been forced to fight it out on the surface with single escorts, but not many of those stories had happy endings for the U-boat crews. In our situation, we were facing a half-dozen enemy warships supported by warplanes. Those were impossible odds, even for a U-boat in perfect condition. The pièce de résistance, of course, was that we were in far from perfect condition. We had no steering or diving control, no rear torpedo tubes, and already had a breach in the hull to boot. Even the greenest midshipman could tell we had zero chance of victory. Only a madman or a butcher of a skipper would have even considered ordering his crew to fight it out under these conditions. Still, it was Lange's decision to make, and we control room mates considered it a matter of honor not to move to abandon ship until the skipper gave the word. Our electric motors were working fine, but because of the jammed diving plates, the old U-505 seemed sluggish in returning us to the surface. It probably only took a minute or two or so for us to get back up, but it seemed like forever. No sooner had the top of our bridge poked itself above the waves than we began to hear the bell-like clang of enemy bullets slamming into our conning tower. A moment later, the heavy stuff started arriving. Our whole boat shook with the concussion of cannon shells and depth charges straddling our hull. I'm not ashamed to admit that I was scared. I felt like a trapped rat, terrified to face the hail of fire hitting us on the outside, but knowing that in another minute our boat and anyone in it would be heading on a one-way trip to the bottom. In a dire crisis like this, there is only one man who can break the inertia of fear and indecision that can grip a crew: the skipper. Lange was never one to ask anybody to do something he wasn't willing to do himself, so he didn't hesitate 1 second. Pushing the watch crew aside, Lange made sure he was the first one up the ladder to the bridge to assess the situation, despite the danger. It seemed like certain death for anyone to step out into the firestorm of bullets out there, but the old man knew it was his duty to check the situation for himself and decide whether we should fight or immediately abandon ship. He popped open the hatch and bravely climbed out onto the bridge, followed closely by our exec, Paul Meyer, and the members of the bridge watch crew. Within the blink of an eye, our skipper was cut down by shrapnel from a shell that hit our upper deck. A moment later, a swarm of fighters swooped down and sprayed the conning tower with heavy machine-gun fire. Most of the bridge watch were wounded, but some boys still managed to make it to the anti-aircraft guns and fire back at the planes. Paul Meyer had tried to man one of the guns, but he too was hit and fell to the deck, blood streaming over his face. Despite frightening leg wounds, Lange crawled back to the conning tower hatch and shouted down to us the order to scuttle and abandon ship. That was all the Raccoon, our chief engineering officer, needed to hear. He was standing right next to me when he started screaming, "Out! Out! We're sinking!" A great mob of men from the aft end of the boat suddenly stampeded through the control room to scale the ladder to the bridge. I could clearly hear the cries of men being wounded by gunfire as the crew poured out onto the deck. Most of us control room mates stayed at our posts to make sure the scuttling order was carried out. We kept looking around for Hauser, our chief engineering officer, because we needed to know if he had set the demolition charges. He was nowhere to be found. We quickly learned the Raccoon had already jumped overboard. Wonderful, we thought. He was busy saving his own worthless neck instead of carrying out his final and most important duty aboard our boat. Note: after the war, Hauser's son told me his father claimed to have single-handedly saved U-505 on 3 separate occasions, and that he deserved a great medal for his bravery. In my opinion, he deserved a medal from the Allies because that guy did a lot more harm to us than good. Unfortunately, for security reasons, only the skipper, the executive officer, and the chief engineering officer knew how to set the timer for the demolition charges. Since all 3 of them were already wounded or had evacuated the boat, it was obvious it was going to be up to us enlisted men to devise another plan for scuttling U-505. In the absence of any officers, Engineering Petty Officer Holden Reed assumed control of the situation. He ordered us to open up the diving tanks once the rest of the crew was safely overboard. That would give us about 30 seconds to get out of the boat before she slipped under the waves. We waited for the last of the men to evacuate the compartment, which seemed like an eternity. The very second they were clear, we tried to open the valves to let water into the tanks. All went well except for forward main diving tanks 6 and 7. Something was preventing the relief valves on those big tanks from opening. We tried again and again to open those damned valves, but with no luck. We even tried to push the controls by hand, but the operating shafts had been bent by the force of the depth charges and wouldn't budge. We knew the air bubbles hanging in number 6 and 7 might prevent the boat from going down, but no one could think of an alternative. We finally gave up and made a dash for the conning tower ladder, hopeful that the holes in the hull would fill the boat with enough water to send her down. I had already started climbing the ladder to the conning tower when I suddenly remembered the sea strainer located on the deck close to my duty station. The sea strainer is a filter mechanism for the main pump, with a bucket-shaped removable sieve set inside a 12-inch steel housing. Acting on impulse, I ran back and unlocked the 4 clamps and removed the heavy steel cover of the sea strainer. A dinner plate-sized stream of water started gurgling out of the main pump line into the boat. As the water flowed back toward the stern, I felt sure this would be enough to sink our beloved U-505. Then, in a move that I would regret for the rest of my life, I tossed the sea strainer cover down onto the deck plates in the corner of the control room. If I had thrown the strainer cover down into the bilge where no one could reach it, U-505 would have had a very different ending. Having done my duty, or more precisely the chief engineering officer's duty, I decided it was high time to get the hell out of our sinking boat. I was small but very strong back in those days. My crewmates said I could move through the confines of the submarine with the agility of a weasel. But on this occasion I broke all my previous speed records getting back up that ladder. The bulkheads of the conning tower were resonating with the metallic clang of bullets and shrapnel when the rush began to abandon ship. From the inside of the sub, the hits on our boat sounded like a group of boys throwing rocks at a trash can. I was terrified by the thought of what was happening to my crewmates out there. but not as terrified as I was to be the only man left inside that sinking boat. By the time I began climbing to the conning tower, however, the bursts of fire had subsided. The shouts of men outside on the deck began to get louder than the blood pounding in my ears from my racing heart. My head swam from adrenaline and the fresh oxygen-rich air pouring into the boat. When I got to the top hatch on the bridge, I stuck my head up to survey the situation. It took a moment or two for my eyes to adjust to the brightness of the sunlight. When they did, the first thing I saw was poor Gottfried Fischer, one of the radio room crewmen. His body was torn and twisted, and he was obviously dead. The whole bridge deck was slippery with pools of foamy brine, tinted red from the blood of wounded men. I made my way over to the leeward side of the conning tower, the one area of the boat shielded from enemy fire. Everything seemed to be moving in slow motion. I took a quick glance around at the long gray hulls of the enemy destroyers. They were circling in for the kill like a pack of jackals. I could also see my crewmates floating in the sea, clusters of them strung out in a long line behind the boat. I climbed over as quickly as I could to the lee side of the conning tower. There were a few other men huddled there trying to deploy a large inflatable life raft. I lent a hand for a moment, then joined them in the raft. We were afraid the destroyers might be preparing to ram, so we paddled frantically away from the boat. When I glanced back at her, however, I realized U-505 was still fully underway with her electric motors. Before we knew it, she was hundreds of meters away, barely visible above the waves. I remember to this day how hard I tried to get one last glimpse of our battered old boat before she joined her many sisters at the bottom of the Atlantic. Our attention quickly shifted to staying afloat in the water until, hopefully, we were picked up by the Americans. Some of the boys thought the airplanes were strafing survivors in the water. I thought the planes were shooting the water between our boat and us to prevent anyone from reboarding her. If they were, they could have saved their ammo, for none of us was crazy enough to want to get back aboard U-505 because she was slowly but surely going down. We were scattered along a fairly extensive arc of ocean. The water was warm but choppy. We tried to gather ourselves into groups and get the more heavily wounded men out of the water to stop their bleeding. Word spread that our skipper was badly wounded in the legs, and we were particularly concerned about him. The big raft in which I was sitting was soon filled to overflowing with men. With all the blood in the water, we were very fearful of sharks. Even those of us who were not wounded were very reluctant to leave that raft. At this point, my story intersects with that of my friend Wolfgang Schiller, one of the forward torpedo room crewmen. What follows is his recollection of the capture as told in an excerpt from a letter he wrote to me last year. In an atmosphere of intense anxiety, I was standing in the forward torpedo room at the communication tube and heard the voice of our commander as he looked up and down with the periscope. Each direction he looked, he called out what he saw: "Destroyer! Destroyer!" Looking all around, he saw the hopelessness of our situation and gave us the order to dive deeper. After a short time, the first water bombs exploded. The glass covers of the manometers burst. After it was reported to the old man that water was breaking in and that the rudder was damaged, he ordered us back to the surface and to abandon ship. I forwarded his order to all the comrades in the torpedo room. In a short time I was all alone. I did not want to leave my wristwatch, which was hanging on one of the pipelines, so I was a little late in getting to the control room. On my way through the officers' rooms, I saw a lamb's wool sweater laying there, so I put it on, thinking that the water might get cold after a while. I was only wearing a pair of navy shorts and a civilian shirt. I had sailcloth shoes without socks, one of which I lost in the water. I put on my emergency breather gear over the sweater. After a little while, I got to the escape hatch. Vilmar, who was from Berlin, held me back. He was timing our escape in between the rhythms of the aircraft strafing passes to prevent casualties. As I came out into the dazzling sunlight, I became blinded. Then I saw a plane coming up from starboard, and I tried to take shelter behind the shield of the anti-aircraft gun. But because I could not make it in time under the hail of bullets, I just jumped onto the starboard side of the deck. It was at that point that I was probably grazed by some bullets, because later, when I opened the oxygen bottles on my breathing gear, I found 2 burned bullet holes on the left shoulder and left wrist of the thick wool sweater. I drifted quickly away from the boat. A destroyer came toward my direction, yielded a little, and a sailor threw a rope to me. I was lucky I didn't catch the rope, because it would have pulled me into the propeller. Then I swam to a big life raft that was loaded with so many comrades that it was almost under water. One of them was scooping water out of the raft with an empty food can. Someone, I think it was Fricke, asked me if I was still strong enough to swim over to Becker. Becker was a great distance away from us and was calling for help. I answered yes, if someone will come with me. Hans Goebeler volunteered to come with me to rescue Becker. I kept feeling something brush against my naked leg as I swam, so I asked Hans if he saw a shark following me. He said, "Yes, swim faster, there's a shark right behind you." There were reflections of the sun on the waves, so I couldn't see for myself. Later, I found out that in my hurry I had forgotten to fasten the belt of the breathing gear. It was the belt that I felt rubbing against my leg, not a shark. When we got to Becker, we found that he was not wounded, so we didn't need to carry him. He swam under his own power with us back to the raft. Note: Schiller was a slow swimmer, so I told him there was a shark behind him to make him swim faster. While we bobbed in the surf, we watched with amusement as the Americans chased our still circling boat with motorized whaleboats. Eventually they managed to board her, but we were still confident that it was only a matter of time before she slipped beneath the waves. After all, only a sliver of her bow and conning tower were still above water. We joked to each other that old U-505 might take more Americans down with her all alone than when she was crewed. Our amusement slowly turned to concern, however, as more time passed. The boat, while still barely above water, stubbornly refused to sink. I told a few of my mates that I had uncovered the sea strainer. Was it possible that one of the Americans had found the cover and replaced it? It seemed impossible. Of course, as we now know, that's precisely what happened. Captain Daniel V. Gallery, the commander of the hunter-killer task force that forced us to the surface, had specifically trained a prize crew to board and capture a U-boat in just such circumstances. The Americans managed to enter our boat just before she sank and replace the sea strainer cover. The cover had lost its gasket and was therefore still leaking a little, but not dangerously. A little later, they used a sailor's T-shirt to seal the gap completely. Over the course of the next couple days, they took U-505 in tow, recharging her batteries, and blew her ballast tanks to equalize her surface trim. In doing so, our boat became the first enemy vessel seized on the high seas by the U.S. Navy since the War of 1812. Climbing down through that hatch into the dark conning tower of a sinking enemy submarine is the most heroic act I've ever heard of. The courageous American sailor who found his way into the control room and replaced the sea strainer cover was Zenon Luke Lukosius. Luke and I became good friends during U-505 reunions I later organized in Chicago, and we even appeared together in a television special about the capture. What he and those other American sailors did to salvage U-505 is the very definition of bravery. Once the shock and shame of having our sub captured wore off, we were compelled to congratulate Gallery and his gallant men on their audacity and courage. Some of this, of course, we did not know until much later. At any rate, after an hour or so of anxious waiting, we finally got fished out of the drink by one of the enemy ships, the destroyer escort Chatelaine. U.S. Navy photographers with motion picture cameras recorded much of our rescue. Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry's film on the capture of U-505 shows several crewmen, including me, being herded onto the deck of the destroyer. All of us are wearing the same wide grins. We were happy, happy, happy to be alive. We believed we had done our duty and put down our share of enemy shipping, and now were one of the few U-boat crews to survive the sinking of their own boat. Besides, even then in the summer of 1945, we still had confidence Germany would eventually win the war. We knew about the fabulous new U-boats being built and were confident that the smug grins worn by our American guards would someday be on our faces. Our treatment at the hands of the Americans was fairly good. Several of our crew had been wounded during our evacuation of the boat, and they were given immediate medical treatment. The more seriously wounded were taken to the sick bay, including our skipper, Harold Lange, who had to have his leg amputated. Note, to this day, I can't believe poor Fisher was the only fatality on either side during the engagement. Our low casualties were all the more remarkable when one considers the weight of firepower thrown against us. For instance, according to U.S. Navy records, the Chatelaine alone fired 1 torpedo, 14 depth charges, 24 hedgehogs, 48 rounds of 3-inch cannon, 328 rounds of 40-millimeter cannon, and 955 rounds of 20-millimeter heavy machine gun ammo at us. There were too many rounds fired by 50-caliber machine guns to count, and that barrage was just from one ship. Once the wounded were attended to, the rest of us were searched, stripped, and herded together under close guard by sailors armed with enormous-looking Thompson submachine guns. Every once in a while we got a glimpse of U-505. There were still several whaleboats moored to her, and American sailors were crawling all over her decks. At one point the destroyer Pillsbury pulled right alongside her. To our immense satisfaction, we learned that our boat's bow diving plane cut a long slash in the hull of the American ship, almost sinking her. That gave us something to cheer about, at least momentarily. I felt especially jolly about the incident because the control shaft to that diving fin was the one I had picked up in Bordeaux. At the time, however, a sick feeling was growing deep in our stomachs because of the failure of our boat to sink. The presence of several highly classified documents left aboard was a particular concern. I was obsessed with trying to remember whether the sea strainer cover I removed had fallen into the bilge where it couldn't be recovered. Of course, the Americans really didn't need the cover, because all it took was a wrench to shut off the valve and stop the inflow of water. Nevertheless, my spirit sank into a private kind of hell as I mentally relived my last moments aboard our boat over and over again. We were eventually moved to the aircraft carrier Guadalcanal for detention. Once there, we were showered with seawater to wash off the diesel oil that had leaked from our boat's ruptured fuel lockers. Our crew was then split into 2 halves. My group was thrown into a big cage-like compartment located right below the flight deck. The compartment was adjacent to the carrier's engine exhausts, and the heat radiating on us was truly frightful. Over the course of the next couple of weeks, we each lost 20 or 30 pounds from sweating. One American sailor eventually took pity on us and moved a fan so that it blew cool air towards us. An officer came by and angrily ordered it to be pointed away from us. Once the officer left, though, that good seaman turned the fan back toward us. It just goes to show that there are always some people who remember that one's enemy is still a human being. Grinning, gum-chewing American sailors kept telling us that they had captured our boat with all of our secrets intact. We did not want to believe them and suspected the story was just a ruse to elicit information from us. But every time we glimpsed U-505 with a big American flag flying from her bridge, we knew our brave old boat had indeed been captured intact, including our code books. As if that wasn't enough, a little while later our captors told us the Allies had landed in France and that the long-awaited invasion of Europe had begun. The story about the invasion didn't worry me much. Even if true, I was confident our comrades in the Wehrmacht could handle any invasion, just as they had at Dieppe. But the idea that we had allowed our boat to be captured was a devastating blow. My role in the attempted scuttling of the boat made me feel particularly bad, especially when I learned they had indeed replaced the sea strainer cover that I had removed. It's not an exaggeration to say these were the worst few days in my life. Our depression over U-505's capture was probably what gave the American commander, Captain Dan Gallery, the mistaken
and ears. Essential to the experience of the Battle of Britain pilots, so very different from any that had gone before, was the feeling of being part of a larger armed force. Although the pilot's world rarely went further than the limits of his squadron, he knew only too well that his squadron was just one piece of many, being assembled and reassembled to counter the ever-changing threat from across the Channel. It accounts for those archetypal Battle of Britain vignettes, the pilots in their Mae West life jackets playing cards or just snoozing in deck chairs, waiting for the phone to ring. That was what connected them to the battle at large, and its sound would remain a powerful psychological totem for all Battle of Britain pilots, the moment they would be catapulted from rest to full combat, often not before they'd been sick first. It was what accounted for the strange new language they all had to learn, the fact the RAF, in distinct contrast to the Luftwaffe, had put VHF radio in all its fighters. The controller's voice became the great guiding force in the conflict. All those altitude and direction details, the tags, and the slang by which squadrons would be scrambled, and led as accurately as possible into harm's way, were all a product of this new machinery of command and control. Not just jargon, but proof that this was a battle not only being fought by more sophisticated planes, but a much more sophisticated front line. Nigel Rose recalls the change to VHF from the old TR-9 radios as
very, very valuable to us. There was one famous occasion when we were on the same wavelengths as the Germans who were coming in towards us, but apart from that there was as little chatter as possible. This was the rule, so as not to interrupt anybody shouting that something had been seen. And quite often it was the same chap in our squadron when I was flying. He had the most wonderful eyes. He was killed later on, unfortunately, during the Battle of Britain, but he had the most terrific eyesight, and he would yell "bandits at 3 o'clock high," or something like that, whereupon the squadron commander would make sure he could see them too, and we'd fly as a squadron, flying all together in the right direction.
Gerald Stapleton confesses to breaking radio silence on more than one occasion.
On the radio we could hear each other talking, and I used to do some stupid things. I used to sing a song called Night and Day over the radio, and George Denham, the squadron leader, used to say, "What the hell do you think you're doing, blocking the radio up?" I sang, though, because I was exhilarated. I was excited, very excited, and tingling with exhilaration, and sort of keeping an eye on everything when we went on to fours. You had time to look around, and at one stage, when I was on my own, I got up to 34,000 feet, and I could see Paris, I could see Plymouth, and I could see Hull. It was a perfect day.
All the RAF pilots appreciated the benefits of the control system. Nigel Rose recalls,
The radar was very efficient, and the WAFs were absolutely wonderful, doing the plotting and so on. We could hear calls made to the squadron commander by the sector commander down somewhere in a padded cell with the WAFs all around him and the map of the south coast. And he would say, Villa leader, there's 50-plus coming in over Celsius Angels, or whatever. We needed those particulars, the size of the raid and the height and the speed, the rate at which he was coming in over the sea or the land.
The mention of WAFs, members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, brings in a significant fact. For the first time, women were now involved in something approximating the front line. In a move then considered risky, they became the plotters in the heart of the operations rooms, often in unprotected buildings above ground. It was their job to translate the information coming from the filter room onto the map tables, courtesy of a long wooden rake similar to those used on roulette tables. Many were in their early 20s, having passed a psychiatric evaluation before being allowed to take on these duties. No one was quite certain in those patriarchal days whether these young women would be able to endure the crushing stress of being bombed virtually every day. The vast majority did. There was a key day early on when for the first time a 100-plus symbol was used, to the incredulous scepticism of the group controller, who until that point hadn't seen formations larger than a dozen. Convinced it was an error, he bawled out the WAF officer, only to find out it was true. The Germans were indeed coming in.
To his wife, buried among the endearments and minutiae of his existence, it is possible to detect a murmur of doubt as to whether the war was worth it. One day in August, the reality of the war in the East was brought home to him again when one of the ship's doctors showed him photographs in a medical journal of soldiers whose eyes had been damaged in action. "My God, how appalling," he wrote to his wife. "How much men suffer today at the effects of this horrible war, where the heroic sudden death seems more merciful than the alternative." He predicts that every day in the East will one day be engraved in golden letters in a history of Germany. But he goes on to wonder, what are they compared to what these battles have done to the mothers, the women, and the brides of the dead and badly wounded heroes? He was ready to fight if the circumstances arose. It was not to be. At the end of October, he left the ship, to be reunited with his beloved Klersel and his family in Berlin. The mood of frustration led directly to one episode which provided a stark reminder to all on board that they were in the business of life and death. One morning, in August 1942, while Tirpitz lay at Borgen Bay, the early muster revealed that one of the crew was missing. His name was Bernhard Turowski. He was 18 years old and served as a gunner on a flak battery. Enquiries revealed that he had last been seen the previous afternoon. The ship was searched, but there was no sign of him. The authorities on shore were alerted, and after 4 days, Turowski, wearing civvies and guarded by 2 military policemen, was dragged back on board showing signs of having been beaten. He had been captured 30 miles away, close to the Swedish border. He was carrying a compass and pistol, stolen, it turned out, from one of the ship's Arado pilots. A few days after his capture, Turowski appeared before a court-martial convened in the main lecture hall. He was condemned to death, with the sentence to be carried out on the following day. That night, Turowski was allowed to eat a last supper with his comrades. Among them was Herbert Ludwig, who knew and liked the condemned man. They had cut all the buttons off his uniform and removed the swastika, he recalled. He had ordered himself a good meal as his final wish, and, to our astonishment, had eaten quietly with no complaining or recriminations. We said our goodbyes full of emotion. We, not he, had tears in our eyes. The motives that led Turovsky to swim ashore and head for the border, fully aware of the penalty for desertion, remain unclear. He was reported to have told the court-martial that he was driven by simple boredom. A story went round the ship that he was intending to head for the United States, either to join up with the Allies or deliver a plea for peace, according to who was telling it. Ludwig maintained that he was badly bullied by his battery officer. However, Hein Hellendorn, a flak artillery officer friendly with the officer who defended Turovsky, never heard that he had had a difficult time on board. On the 4th of September, the sentence was carried out in front of the entire ship's company. The ship's log recorded a cloudy day and a choppy sea. The execution was timed at 3:50 in the afternoon. Shortly before, Turovsky was brought up from below, blindfolded, and led to a point behind the aftergun turret. The firing squad was made up of 8 men from Turovsky's battery. One of the rifles was loaded with blank ammunition. Turovsky was tied to a rail. Pastor Müller, the ship's chaplain, spoke a few words of comfort and asked him if he had anything to say. Turovsky simply thanked the pastor for his kindness. At the command, "Fire," his body straightened and fell to one side, remembered Ludwig. His corpse was taken to a military cemetery ashore, but the authorities there refused to bury it. It was returned to the ship and later sewn into a weighted sack and dropped into the fjord. Tirpitz's time at Borgen was by then coming to a close. Despite her inactivity and a careful regime of maintenance, she was due for a major overhaul. A report drawn up by the ship's technical officers on the 15th of September 1942 listed a large number of necessary repairs and improvements, ranging from the engines and guns to the freshwater drinking tanks and fire extinguishers. The hull's magnetic field also had to be neutralized to prevent it triggering mines, degaussed in technical parlance. Proper port facilities were required to do the job properly, and they were not available in the Narvik area. After Hitler again judged the risk of sailing her to Germany was too great, she set off back to Trondheim, weighing anchor on the 23rd of October and arriving in Vattenfjord the following day. 2 days later, the Arthur put to sea from Lunevaux with the chariots and their crew on their mission to destroy the battleship. In the flap that followed the failed attack, Tirpitz started to shift her mooring frequently, moving around a succession of berths, all at the eastern end of Trondheim's fjord, and divers made regular inspections of the hull. At the end of November, a PRU reconnaissance flight reported seeing her at Låfjord, the neighbouring narrow inlet to the north. Her hull was painted in dazzle camouflage, with broad black diagonal strips on the port side, at the bow and the stern, designed to make her look considerably shorter than her true length. Another ship, identified as the Stavanger Fjord, a depot ship for the workers brought in from the Kiel dockyard to carry out the refit, was alongside. A few days later, a local agent reported the presence of a 100-ton floating crane and that major repairs were underway. The work threw the orderly world of the ship into chaos. The noise really was appalling, fraying our nerves, Adalbert Brunner remembered. It was astonishing how poorly soundproofed the iron box was. Everywhere you turned, there was something in the way. Cabling, air and gas pipes, transformers, tools of every kind, and lastly, the workers themselves. By the 17th of December, the refit was completed and the workers had all gone home. Tirpitz was at full readiness once more, and the mood on board was optimistic as Christmas approached. The crew threw their energies into celebrating it in style. A tall fir tree was erected on the afterdeck, and, Decorations festooned every cabin, mess, and gangway. Snow lay deep all around, and stillness settled on the landscape, wrote Brunner. It was like going back to childhood days. On Christmas Day, Top stood on the afterdeck in the thin grey northern daylight, beneath the tree flickering with candles, and gave a speech which emphasised the Christian nature of the holiday. Then, apart from those on watch, the company settled down to enjoy themselves. They ate and drank and listened to a concert given by a mixed choir. There were more celebrations on New Year's Eve. There was a special dinner, and every man got a bottle of wine, extra tobacco, a packet of sweets, and a book. In the wardroom they held a mock trial, and one of the officers did an impression of the Führer. At midnight, Top addressed the company over the tannoy. He repeated the message in his New Year greetings card, distributed to all the crew, in which he spoke frankly about the frustrations of the last 12 months and his hopes for the time to come. He recalled the adventures we all dreamed about during the dash from Wilhelmshaven to Trondheim, sorties to the northern seas, the Arctic seas, the North Atlantic and the coast of France, where they would find success and the laurels of victory. Instead, they had been denied a free-ranging war against merchant vessels on the vast extending oceans. There was, however, nothing to be done. We grit our teeth and bow to the decision of our superiors, even if it is often difficult. We are soldiers and we obey. His message finished on a rousing note. Let us enter the new year as Adolf Hitler's truest and best soldiers, with unyielding faith in our victory and Germany's future, and with the sure expectation that the great hour when we can prove ourselves will arrive. As the festivities continued, 500 miles to the north, other German ships were locked in battle. In the Barents Sea, a force led by the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper had clashed with British escorts protecting the second part of convoy JW-51B on its way to Murmansk. The German force was led by Vice-Admiral Oskar Kummetz, the Kriegsmarine's commander of cruisers. The convoy had been sighted by a U-boat on the 30th of December. Kummetz was on board Hipper at Alta Fjord and immediately put to sea. He had with him the pocket battleship Lutzow and 6 destroyers. Ranged against them were 2 British cruisers, the Sheffield and the Jamaica, and 6 destroyers. The German ships were bigger and better armed than their British opponents, and when battle was first joined, they seemed sure to overwhelm the convoy and its escorts. In the middle of the morning of the 31st of December, in the brief and thin midwinter twilight, the destroyer escort was attacked by Hipper from the north. HMS Onslow was hit, and the escort commander, Captain Sherbrooke, badly wounded. A little later, Lutzow appeared on the convoy's southern flank, but instead of attacking immediately, her captain decided to hold back until the weather improved. Hipper's guns, meanwhile, sank the minesweeper Bramble and crippled the destroyer Achates, which had been laying down smoke to conceal the convoy. Just as a massacre seemed imminent, the British cruisers arrived and opened fire on Hipper. They were mounting 6-inch guns against the enemy's 8-inch main armament. They nonetheless managed to do enough damage to force Kummetz to retire. The cruisers then sighted 2 of the German destroyers and attacked, sinking the Friedrich Eichholt. Shortly afterwards, Kummetz ordered his squadron back to port. The Sheffield and the Jamaica gave chase, but by 2 p.m. Hipper had been swallowed up by the Arctic darkness. The British could feel considerable satisfaction at the outcome. They had held off a significantly more powerful force for the loss of 1 minesweeper sunk and 1 destroyer damaged. All 14 ships of the convoy had escaped serious damage and continued to Murmansk unmolested to join the 15 others that had arrived safely on Christmas Day. For the German Navy, the Battle of the Barents Sea as it became known, was a humiliation. Hitler's anger at the outcome created a crisis that was to affect profoundly the future of the Kriegsmarine. In the weeks that followed, Tirpitz was in greater danger than it had ever faced in its short life. The threat, though, came not from the enemy, but from its own commander-in-chief.
In response to their questions, Ilse explained that the weapons had been taken from the house many weeks ago and that she had assumed they were disposed of or destroyed. Apparently satisfied with this explanation, the sergeant disappeared into the milling mass of GIs. One of Ilse's primary concerns was the brood of newly hatched chicks she had been nurturing in a small brooder near the barn.
These previously unheard-of numbers. It was on those Luftwaffe attackers that Dowding's command system had a devastating impact. Again and again, German pilots were struck not so much by the courage of the RAF or the effectiveness of the Spitfires and Hurricanes ranged against them, but the plotting systems the British were employing. They had anticipated the courage and the planes. It was the RAF's ubiquity that unnerved them. Wherever they flew, from whatever base, at whatever time, it seemed they could rely on one thing. There would be RAF fighters scrambled to meet them. The RAF map of the skies was proving to be a terrifying reality for the incoming Luftwaffe planes. Luftwaffe veteran Hans Eckhard Bob certainly believes that radar gave the RAF an important advantage.
Once I experienced a Spitfire formation all of a sudden coming up from behind, having a clear line of fire, and we wondered how this was even possible, having no visibility whatsoever, neither from above nor from below. How was it possible that an enemy formation was able to get into a firing position from behind? That was the first time we heard about radio direction finding equipment. The English were able to make the best use of this equipment, gaining an advantage, especially in bad weather conditions, so we very much had the disadvantage.
Radar and Germany's failure to recognize its significance were key factors in Britain's survival. No matter how good the engine or how adept the pilot, the Spitfire was useless if he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Battle of Britain would ultimately be about which side could shoot down more of the enemy's planes. The RAF had been mauled over France and had been part of the humiliating evacuation from Dunkirk. The Luftwaffe had been triumphant. This time, however, the Luftwaffe faced the skill and daring and tenacity of the Brillcream boys, armed with their Spitfires and Hurricanes. This time, in the high summer of 1940, things were going
to see my ATEC certificates. That bicycle rider, meaning a person who displays an obsequious posture towards those above him while trampling on those below him, replied, "Not particularly. The tire industry in Kitchener has long had an overabundance of self-styled engineers. All of them imposters shy of academic qualifications. When one looked about at a picnic, a backyard party, or pub sessions, the lickspittles were there, toadying shamelessly. At the age of 41, I was glad to leave engineers-infested B.F. Goodrich in the summer of 1966, even though I knew that I had years of hard work ahead of me at university. By the time of the fall convocation at the University of Waterloo in September of 1971, I had a B.A. and M.A. English and an M.Phil English to my name. The M.Phil stands for Masters of Philosophy, a degree between an M.A. and a Ph.D. The foreign language requirement for the graduate degrees presented no problem for me. After one visit to the Department of Germanic and Slavic Languages and Literatures, I was certified as having a thorough knowledge of German. Neither faculty nor students in the English department ever knew of the nature of my connection with Germany. Throughout my 5 years at university, Helga, in addition to working full-time, spent many hours with me at the university library. She fetched books for me from the stacks, allowing me more time for research. She also typed my essays and, starting in 1969, my thesis. Helga could not have received a more sincere and meaningful accolade for all her hard work in supporting my studies than the one expressed in the presence of the members of the committee convened to hear me defend my thesis. Addressing me, George Hibbard, a professor of English, opened the proceedings by saying,